Greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke, and let me just get started here. Just give me 1 second while I set up, and we shall be on our way. So we're scheduled to begin at 11 p.m. Tokyo time, and by my clock it is about, when it's not about, it's approximately, it's exactly 10:57 p.m. here on Saturday, the 22nd of February, 2020. So we'll give it another minute or so, not a minute, another few minutes or so, and then we will be underway. So just hold on for a little bit, and we'll get going in about 2 or 3 minutes. So you can just enjoy yourselves and maybe say hello to me or to your fellow film fans in the chat room, and we will go from there. So I'm just finishing setting up here. So anyway, I hope you're doing well. And let's see here. So we have Jared is here, and Glenn is here. Mike, Eli is here. So hello, my friends. It's nice to see you. I hope you are well. And Mag Z is here. Hello, my first live stream. Well, hello. It's nice to see you, and it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. So I hope that you are well, Mag Z. Thank you very much. Retro Player 72 is here. Hello. It's nice to see you. And let's see, I just should, my computer here. I'll put my computer in the, never mind, I'm just talking to myself. Okay, so give it another couple minutes and we will be on our way. So once again, the film that we will be discussing is AKIRA. And so I'll talk about this again, but just as kind of a warm-up. If you haven't seen the film, then please be wary, because I will be speaking about spoilers, and so this is going to be a spoiler-filled discussion about this film. So if you haven't seen this film, then please don't, I would recommend that you don't watch this live stream. You can always watch it when the live stream is over and it's uploaded to this channel, but once again, we will be talking about this film, AKIRA. Released in 1988. So I'll just give it one more minute and then we will get started. So please, I hope you are enjoying yourselves and you are having a nice day wherever you are, or maybe depending on where you are in the world, your day is just starting. If so, I hope you have a great rest of your day today, and the like. One more thing, is the sound okay? I have my little microphone hooked up here, but occasionally the sound can act up without me knowing it. So if my sound is a little bit funny, please don't hesitate to let me know about it. And great. Okay, so Jared says the sound is good. So I will now begin. So now it's 11 p.m. So let's begin, shall we? Okay, so greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope all of you are doing very, very well today. This is Saturday, February 22nd, 2020, and it's 11 p.m. here in Tokyo, which means that it is my pleasure, my distinct pleasure and honor to be able to share with you just a few thoughts that I have with respect to this particular film, AKIRA, from 1988. This is the anime film, the Japanese anime film, which is from the mind of Katsuhiro Otomo, and it's a really unique work in many, many respects. It's a very complicated work. It's a very dense work. Its story, I admit, is somewhat confounding and perhaps confusing upon initial watch, and even upon subsequent watches, I will admit. So there is a lot of stuff, I think, going on here. And well, I'll try to address that stuff to the best of my ability over the course of the next couple hours or so. And I will also enjoy hearing your thoughts about this very remarkable and entertaining work. So I will be trying just to direct the discussion here about this film to the best of my ability. Now, before I begin, I should point out just a few things as preliminary matters. So first of all, please note that I will be speaking to this film in some detail, and that will include how the film ends, as well as some key scenes in the film that I think it would be a shame for anyone to watch this live stream and not see this film, because you will be spoiled in terms of plot details. And so I would strongly, strongly recommend that if you haven't seen the film AKIRA yet, please do not continue on with this live stream, but you can turn off the live stream and please watch the film first. And after you have seen the film, you can always come back to this live stream. It will also be uploaded as a video to this YouTube channel after the fact. It won't be live, of course, but you can still watch the live stream if you are interested. But please just be wary that I will not hesitate in speaking in some detail about some specific plot points in this film. So just be careful of that if you are concerned about that sort of information. And also, I should say that with this and with other past discussions about other films, I must emphasize that I am not in any way a film critic, and I am not a historian. I don't count myself as an expert in Japanese anime or Japanese manga, and I don't consider myself in any way a kind of expert in the field of manga studies and anime history. So I won't necessarily be speaking to that aspect of specific anime history when it comes to a discussion of AKIRA. There are some interesting details about the production of this film that I think are related to or are relevant to a discussion of the anime industry as a whole, especially at this time. There are some aspects of this film that are, technically speaking, in terms of anime technology anyway, there are some aspects of this film that are actually quite groundbreaking, and I do want to bring that to your attention if I have the opportunity today. But besides those specific points, in general, I'm not going to, or I don't plan on making any broad discussion about anime in the 1980s or the early to mid 1980s, where this film falls in the timeline of anime. So please, if you are expecting that, please accept my apologies, but I will not be addressing those a broad discussion about anime or the world of anime in general. And also, I want to emphasize that I'm going to be coming to this discussion as a fan of this film, not as any expert in the film or as any kind of person connected with the production or the making of the work. So I don't claim to have any detailed knowledge of this as any related or relevant party to the production of this film. I only come at this as a fan of the work. And so as a fan, I've come to learn about this film, and I've come to watch this film over many, many occasions since I was very young. And it's based on that experience that I will try to fashion my comments and share those thoughts with you over the course of the next hour or so. So if you're looking for a kind of detailed production history of this film, I'm not going to be able to provide that here today. So once again, I don't want to set any unrealistic expectations or anything like that. But I do come to this film as a fan and as a kind of how should I put it, as a kind of a great admirer, very intense admirer of this work. I can say that I've seen this film countless times, countless times. More, I can't begin to even count how many times. It's been that many times, and so it's a film that I really enjoy watching every single time. It's a film that I've discovered something new every single time I see it, and that's really true. That's true. That's a cliche that's oft used in film criticism, I know, but in this case, it's really true. And I feel a certain kinship with this film based on that experience that I have, and so it's on that foundation that I will plan to provide some comments on this film to the best of my ability. So there's that. Finally, I should point out that I won't be talking about the manga serial, the original underlying comic book material upon which many aspects of this film are based. The manga is in and of itself its own living, breathing entity, much like Tetsuo himself, the mutated Tetsuo himself. It's its own living, breathing thing with its own arms and strands that go which way and that way. That it's huge and it's almighty. It's almost unwieldy. It's brilliant. But there are some marked differences between the manga and the anime, some huge differences, in fact, that make the two works, the anime film and the manga film. While there are similarities, there are some stark and marked differences that make the two separate living, breathing entities. And so a kind of a comparative analysis of the two works is way beyond the scope of this particular video or this particular live stream. So I won't be talking about the manga. I think that's good, because anyone who hasn't read the manga, I don't want to spoil those details for you, but I should say here that if you are interested in reading the manga but haven't read the manga, I strongly, strongly recommend it, especially if you've seen the film Akira and you enjoyed the film Akira. If you enjoyed the film Akira, then I know that it's almost positive that you will really get a kick out of reading the manga. So, but this video will not be, or this live stream won't be in any way discussing the manga. That hopefully, maybe, might be something that we can talk about in a separate video one day, who knows. But because I am a huge fan of the manga itself, but that's for another day. Today, I'd like to focus my attention and my energy on the film released in 1988. And so on that note, I should say also that the live chat is free and available for anyone who wants to talk about this, who wants to leave a comment about seeing this film Akira. If you have a question directed towards me, please, I will try to address all the questions to the best of my ability. I won't necessarily be able to answer every single question because I am not a thorough expert in this film. So there are some questions that I won't be able to answer, but I will certainly do my very best. And also I will ask that I will try, but maybe it's quite possible that I won't necessarily be able to address every single person in the live chat, but I will certainly do my best. And if I accidentally skip your name or skip your comment, I apologize. But if you want to leave a comment after the fact, you can always leave a comment under this video or on any other video on this YouTube channel. And finally, I should say that if you have any questions in the live chat directed towards me but are about a different movie, or a different work, I will, with great respect, just skip over those questions directed towards me, to focus my attention on this work, AKIRA, and or my intent for the next hour. It's no, please don't take offense, and if you want to save your question for another question behind as a comment in under this video or any other video, and I will do my best to answer. Okay, so with that in mind, let's begin in earnest with this film. So as an opening salvo or an opening comment, it's just a very general comment to this film. What can I say about this as sort of an opening statement? It's a very, it's a film that's filled with a lot of ideas. It's a film that is a kind of science fiction epic. It's a film that is a sort of post-apocalyptic future film, although it's set in 2019, and so now it's 2020, so it's an interesting detail that now, watching this film, AKIRA, we're actually watching it set in a time that's actually 1 year prior. So that's an interesting detail. But for the longest time, it was always a, what do you call it? It was always a film that was set through certain internal mechanisms of growth on the one hand, or some kind of external stimuli, and sometimes that can be due to the surrounding environment of this metropolitan landscape that is both brilliant and nightmarish at the same time, this Neo-Tokyo. That's where the external stimuli can come from, and also the external stimuli can come chemically, of course, through the process of this kind of sort of unclear yet really vague chemical process that seems to be applied by certain pockets of the government as kind of power mutation. 3, 4 encouraged by the government, because they do have some funnel mechanism that has different related in some way, or maybe they're not related at all, but then they kind of cross connect, and they each have each pockets of characters each has his or her own agendas that they follow throughout their natural course, and that leads oftentimes to a sort of a course collision of ideas, and also of agendas, and also of personalities and philosophies that are on screen for all of us to behold in this world of an anime film that is also a science fiction epic, as I suggested, but also a film about kind of commentary, if you will, about the kind of a nature of political revolution, and also revolution in general. And if we can extrapolate from that a very base general notion of, if we think of revolution as being a kind of a power struggle and power shift, I think we can see that there are lots of things in the film that can suggest to us this idea of power shifts and power struggles, and one party or one individual that has up to now been the oppressed, or the one with less power, somehow overpowering the other and having the upper hand, and thus creating a different dynamic going forward that is further explored in the film. I mean, so we see this throughout the film completely, whether it's the sort of the dynamic that's set up very vaguely with the whole idea of the government and the anti-government, and we have this notion that seems to be suggested, although it's not precisely clear, somehow the former prime minister's tax reforms somehow led to very great civil unrest that leads now to anti-government demonstrations, a lot of high unemployment, usually fueled by a younger crowd, sometimes student riots or demonstrations and that sort of thing. And then you have this idea also of government authoritarianism and abuse of power among the ones with power, and then the powerless being the ones who are demonstrating. And then you also have this idea of how this shifts over time, and what kinds of things are at play that help to create this power dynamic shift that can be labeled as being a kind of political or social upheaval revolution. But that's not all. We have also power struggles within the government infrastructure itself, which is also something I will try to talk to. And the government infrastructure being represented in the film by this Supreme Executive Council that seems to be made up of certain government officials, although it's not quite clear. It seems like that one or more of the members of this council seem to be from the Diet, which is the legislative body of the Japanese government, at least as far as I understand it. There are some issues also about how the government is structured after the end of the Third World War here, which is part of the story. Yeah, I'm not sure if the government structure is the same as the current structure that we have actually in Japan now, or is it a slightly different structure to take into account certain adjustments that had to be made in government administration after the end of the Third World War. Who knows? All this, I mean, is there still a constitution and that sort of thing? All these questions are still up in the air, and they're never answered in the film. But the point that I want to make here in the opening statement is that there are political factional struggles even within the government itself. I think it's represented by this executive high council on the one hand, and certain other factionalizations that are made more complicated by this character, Mr. Nezu, and his relationship with Ryu, who seems to be part of this anti-government terrorist group, who is also related to Kei in some way, etc., etc. And then on the other side of that coin is the colonel, and he seems to be part of this somewhat maybe military or quasi-military operation that is also dealing not only with the security of the city, but also some kind of scientific study with respect to what we understand to be subjects that are children, but not all of them, and trying to in very general terms somehow chemically encourage or to encourage by use of some kind of chemical stimulus, some kind of paranormal activity, or some kind of ESP power within these people, whether that be some kind of telekinesis or some kind of mind control or mind reading on the part of these children. So this is all a kind of government project that we understand it to be, although the details are very vague as far as who exactly is in control of this, what is the government jurisdiction, what actual bodies of the or organs of the government are actually involved here, etc. So it's never really made clear, at least in the context of the film. But the point I want to make is that even in this story, we have this idea of a power struggle within this high executive level of government, such that we get towards maybe the latter half of the film, this idea of a military coup d'etat led by the colonel, of course. And this is after the rise of Tetsuo and the threat of Tetsuo and the threat that he brings to Neo-Tokyo and the potential destruction of Neo-Tokyo in the city. And so that leads to the colonel's decision to lead or mount a coup d'etat, which in effect renders the executive council members powerless. So that's, in a sense, another kind of power struggle or power upheaval or power shift that is in itself a kind of political revolutionary act. And then also there's a kind of a power shift that occurs on a personal level in the storyline that we see with Tetsuo and Kaneda in particular. The gang hierarchy or the power hierarchy that exists at the beginning of the film versus how it transforms throughout the film, and then how it ends up by the end of the film. And just in very general terms, we have this idea of Kaneda being the leader of the gang, and we have other people in the gang, most prominently, of course, people like Yamagata and Kai, and then also Tetsuo. But they seem to be following Kaneda's lead, and Kaneda always seems to be the leader of this group. But when Tetsuo begins to develop his psychic powers to the point where they become physically destructive, and he realizes that he has more power than anyone else, including Kaneda, then he is the one who seems to feel this kind of power trip, and therefore there is a sort of power struggle between the two of them, Kaneda and Tetsuo, and that forms, I think, one of the key components of this film, and also it leads to a very emotionally resonant core of this film. That is the emotional resonance that is generated as a result of this continually evolving relationship between these two characters, the two main characters of the film, I would assert, those being Kaneda and Tetsuo. And it's all based, or I would say it's primarily based on this idea of a continuing power shift in terms of who is the superior alpha male of that relationship. And I think that is, in and of itself, another power struggle. It's another representation of a kind of revolutionary the depiction of revolutionary power shift dynamics at play, and it is all set against a tableau of brilliantly conceived science fiction ideas, things that are developed and just layered upon each other, and little things that really tweak an idea. An idea begins, something is presented on screen, and it just layers on, and it just develops and develops more, and so the interest is generated further until at last it just explodes in a kind of fleshy, gooey mess. Or also, potentially, it explodes in a flash of light that it creates an almost cleansing, soothing, quite hypnotically beautiful a power to it. And I'm referring, of course, to the ending of the film, which I will also try to address later on in this discussion if I have time. This is all to say, of course, that this is a film that is filled with a lot of ideas, and sometimes the ideas aren't necessarily so cleanly or clearly presented. There is there is a considerable deal of confusion as far as how to follow the plot, and I will try to talk about that later. I admit that there are some aspects of the film that I still don't quite understand myself, but I think if we can try to follow the plot, and I think that is a very useful exercise, and it makes the film very rewarding on that level. But even if we can't necessarily follow the exact machinations and the developments of each particular plot strand of the film, I think we can still enjoy this film quite remarkably and quite intensely. And that's because this is a film that I think also operates on a kind of intuitive level, or an emotional level, or sort of a gut feeling sort of level. In other words, there are things that are thrown at us on the screen that feel a little bit like, what does that mean? Or why is this character talking to this character? What does this character want? Or that sort of thing. But even if we don't necessarily get all of those, we can still get the gist of the story, and we can still follow kind of what's going on, and we can see how it leads to a sort of conclusion that might not necessarily seem to answer all of the questions that we have, because it's a very mysterious film, but it also is something that I think feels very satisfying, because, as I say, it seems to be operating also on a very gut level, intuitive, emotional level. And I think that ultimately comes down, once again, to the key relationship in this film, that being the relationship between Kaneda and Tetsuo. It's a very powerfully depicted, emotional, complex relationship. It's a really brilliantly conceived thing. And I will try to speak more to that later with a little bit more detail, I hope. But also, so this is to say that I think as much as the film is seemingly very complicated, it's also in a very paradoxical way kind of easy to follow, if that makes any sense at all. And I think one of the reasons also that makes it sort of easy to follow, and how it feels like it's an intuitively understandable film, even though it might not necessarily seem to have the most fully comprehensible plot on the planet. The reason why I think it's easily accessible in that way, it's that I think each of the characters really seems to be able, at least in the moment in time that they are depicted on the screen or in the anime, whatever their past is, whatever their past agenda is, whatever their past stories are, where they came from, etc. At least in the moment of the film, they are standing for something. And, excuse me, the way they are presented, they always proclaim something. When they talk to other characters, there's always a clear proclamation of what they stand for and who they are and why they are talking and what they are thinking. And there's almost a loud proclamation of who they are. I mean, this comes down to one of the most iconic parts of this film about how the characters always scream out their names or scream out the names of the other people on the screen as well. I mean, the most iconic being Kaneda, Tetsuo, and these names are just called out every single time. Yamagata, Kei, Kai, right? And that sort of thing. But in particular, Kaneda and Tetsuo, it's done quite a lot. And I think it has an almost, how should I put it? It almost feels like they are. It's certainly not a kind of realism of the expression of human emotion, that's for sure, because you don't necessarily see people talking, at least I don't, in my real life. I don't necessarily see people communicating with each other in the same way that Kaneda and Tetsuo communicate with each other, and that's, I don't say Daisuke, or I don't say anything like that usually in my daily life. But that is my way of trying to illustrate that this film is not meant to be in trying to depict the human relationships with any kind of realistic way, I think. That's not also, I mean, it's an anime for one, but also in terms of its actual pure depiction of these characters, it seems to be almost on the level of a kind of opera, an elevated, heightened reality, or heightened, not even reality, that's a poor choice of words, but it's almost a heightened sense of drama to the point where each person almost stands in for something else, or it's sort of a representation of a kind of, I don't know if you want to call it id, ego, or superego, but I think to put it in just very more general terms, I think it's Tetsuo and Kaneda, and sort of these forces that are just about to collide. It's almost on a level of opera in terms of how characters in an opera, they proclaim what they feel, they shout out people's names, or they sing out something of substance and feeling and worth to them that leads to a development in the drama. Well, I think Akira is, as a film, it's kind of the anime equivalent of an opera, if you will, or it's sort of a science fiction opus that is presenting its characters in a way that a great opera would present its characters. And so I think there's a lot to that, which I think makes for an interesting segue for anyone who's interested in how this film depicts characters and shows how characters connect and how they communicate and how they express themselves. It's a very heightened, dramatic way in which they do that. And I think that is also something that makes this film very accessible and very easy to understand, because even though we might not necessarily know all of the backstory and the specific details of each of these characters' upbringings and things like that, we can still understand what it is they are feeling in the moment, because they are proclaiming it and they are just shouting it for everyone to know. And I think that's a really wonderful way of expressing information, giving information, and also making sure that everyone in the audience is kept up to speed in terms of what the story is doing at this particular moment. This is all to say that I think this film is a very wonderful work that is at once seemingly complicated, but it's also very easy to follow, or potentially so. And it has many riches and rewards that will come with many, many viewings of this. So the more times you watch this, I think the more it offers. And so I really, really value this film very much. But I've barely scratched the surface in talking about this film, but let me stop there and let's go to the live chat, and then we will go from there. So, let's see. Glenn, okay, so Alan is here. Hello, Alan. I hope you're well. Wolfgratz is here. Hello. Let's see. Okay, there's talk in the live chat about the rumor or the news about, in the past, that we heard about maybe Hollywood is trying to make this into a live action film or something like that. Of course, of course. I won't go into that because I want to talk about this film. But yes, I know these rumors. I've heard them a lot. So there's Darumo is here. Dory the Hobbit is here. Hello. Alan says, a beautiful movie, amazing animation and music. Yes, and the music is really great. Gei no Yamashiro Gumi. I'll talk about that later. Really, really great. Let's see. Wolfrat says, I was confused by this story. There, I admitted. No, there's nothing. There's nothing. There's nothing wrong with that, my friend. As I tried to suggest, the story is, I think, very, very confusing. Actually, let me, before I forget, let me just talk about the story for a minute. So let's try to figure out exactly what's going on. And if I get my details wrong here, please feel free to correct me. But okay, so we have the bike gang storyline, which is Kaneda and his gang, which has Tetsuo and Kai and Yamagata, and they seem to be having a rivalry with another rival gang, headed by these people wearing masks. Or there's this guy who looks like a clown, and they are referred to in the film as the Clowns. So there seems to be some kind of rivalry between these gangs that are based on these motorcycles that are driving through different parts of this vast city of Neo-Tokyo in 2019. Okay, and then we have Neo-Tokyo itself. So what is this Neo-Tokyo? What's going on? All we know is from the very beginning, we understand that on July 16th, 1988, something happened, right? We don't even know what happened. And in fact, in the film, some of the characters in the executive, the Supreme Executive Council meeting, if you recall, they seem to, at least they say out loud, they seem to say that they don't even know what the relationship is between AKIRA and the start of the Third World War. They don't even know what exactly happened. Some of them don't anyway. I think the colonel does, and some other people do. But there seems, therefore, to be some kind of confusion with exactly the details of what happened with World War III, what this explosion was we see at the very beginning. Was it an explosion? Was it a nuclear explosion? Who knows? We will find out later that it seems to have something to do with AKIRA and some kind of manifestation, outward physical manifestation of some kind of innate or internal extrasensory power that he seemed to have, and just became this huge thing that led to the destruction of the city, because we understand that there had to be some kind of rebuilding of the city. Okay, but the details of what happened in the war aren't clear, at least in the film anyway. You don't get any sense of what was this, an explosion? Was it this explosion that caused the destruction of the city? How much destruction to the city actually occurred? If this wasn't the cause of the destruction, what happened that caused the destruction? Was there any kind of subsequent attack from other countries? What was this thing to begin with? Exactly. There are so many questions that even when we see the film, we don't quite know what's going on. But we understand just on a general intuitive sense that some cataclysmic event or events happened. Maybe there is something to do with AKIRA. We don't know, that sort of thing. But that leads us now to that leads us to what, 31 years after the fact. And we are here at Neo-Tokyo 2019. Speaking of AKIRA, we don't quite know what or who this AKIRA is until the very end. Even when we get to the very end, it's still not quite clear. Let's see. Well, let's stick with that then. So what is about the government structure here? Now, we understand that there's a Supreme Executive Council that is made up of a number of members. They are men. They are elderly men for the most part. One of the members is one of the members says that he's a member of the National Diet, or the legislative body. So that might suggest that one or more of those members are also national legislatures. legislators, but we're not quite sure. Some might be cabinet members, I don't know. There's also some backstory that we hear a little bit about the former prime minister and his tax reforms that leads to the current chaos that seems to be existing between the government and anti-government forces. But this is all to say that this stuff about what this Supreme Executive Council actually is, who those specific members are they all Diet members? Are they cabinet members of the Prime Minister's cabinet? Who is the current Prime Minister? It's all not quite clear, at least in the information that's provided in the film. All we do know is that there is this guy named, there's a guy named the Colonel. There is another guy that we've seen whose name is Mr. Nezu, who has a look like a rat or a mouse, which is very fitting because his name Nezu is somewhat similar to the word Nezumi in Japanese, which means mouse or rat. There's another old guy that seems to be some kind of older politician that we see talking with the colonel in an earlier scene, but that's all we know about the Supreme Executive Council. We don't know anything about the current structure of government. We don't know about the constitution, the constitutional makeup of the government. We don't know how the government is structured, if there are any changes that were made to the government structure as a result of the Third World War or anything like that. So we don't quite know. We never see any shots of the Diet. We never see anything like that. All we know is what we can glean from this one scene of the Executive Council, which is that there seems to be issues about budget depletion. There's also issues about how to explain these recent sort of potentially scandalous things about the abduction of one of the little Espa children, which ends up being Takashi, number 26, and also how the colonel seems to be set up because he's trying to ask for an additional, budget proposal, or he's asking for an additional budget in order to be able to cover furtherance of his current project with this scientific team as a result of the recent proclamation of the dream that Kyoko, the young girl, number 25, had, and all that stuff. But then the council turns on the colonel. Because they're trying to question him, or they want to put him before a kind of questioning body of some sort. So that leads him to storm out of the meeting, and then later we understand that he leads a military coup d'etat against the executive council members and orders the rest of all the members, including Mr. Nezu. And that leads to the attack on Nezu's residence, and then it leads ultimately to his own death, which happens later in the film. So that suggests that there's a kind of a rift between certain intragovernmental forces, one led by the colonel, and the other led by or represented by this amorphous or otherwise vaguely represented Supreme Executive Council, whatever that means. But we understand that this is probably the hub of the national government at this time, or at least a representation of it. And on that body is Mr. Nezu. There's also talk about the existence or the possible existence of a mole on the committee or on the council. And we understand that probably this mole is a reference to Mr. Nezu, because we understand also, to make matters more complicated, is that Mr. Nezu, or is known as Nezu-sama, has a relationship with Ryu, who is who's seen as being one of the members of this sort of anti-government terrorist group that seems to be responsible for carrying out acts of terrorism on the public as means of either some kind of violent demonstration on the one hand, or otherwise something trying to create some kind of confusion or chaos in the public on the other, or something like that. That's also not very clear. But Ryu and Kei and all that stuff seem to be part of this anti-government terrorist faction. But what makes it more complicated is that Ryu and Nezu have a relationship. So there seems to be this relationship between someone on the council on the one hand and this terrorist group on the other. Someone who is inside government having a connection with a group that is an anti-government force. So that brings up a whole bunch of questions that I don't think are answered in the film, of course. But for example, why is this relationship there to begin with? Is Nezu the mole? If he is, why is he a mole? What is his purpose? Is it to sow chaos? Is it to create confusion? Is it in order to stage his own power? What do you call? Is it to stage his own sort of seizure of power, to usurp power? We don't know what his position is. Is he a cabinet member? Is he a diet member? We don't know. But maybe he is not necessarily the leader. So maybe this is his attempt. I'm speculating here. Maybe he is going to use the terrorist group in order to foment certain the anti-government demonstrations to the point where it topples the current administration or cabinet and it creates a power vacuum and then he can take charge. I don't know. That's a possibility. Another possibility is that the terrorist group or the anti-government force that Ryu and Kei are a part of, maybe that's not even a anti-government force at all, but maybe it's sort of a government ruse, if you will, because as some of you may know, in actual political revolution or history of political revolutions throughout the world, there have often been instances where government has created a false revolutionary group or small groups of people in order to infiltrate actual revolutionary groups on the ground in order to spy on them, to get information, and to sow seeds of mistrust among the actual party members. And so this could be a kind of representation of that. Maybe this group or Ryu is not an actual revolutionary, but maybe he is a faux revolutionary. It's not clear. It's not clear. And therefore, what is his relationship with Kei? What therefore is Kei's own philosophy? What is her agenda? It seems to be that she has an agenda that is linked more towards her dedication towards Ryu, more so than her dedication towards anything that Nezu or Ryu might otherwise nefariously represent. I'm not sure, because Kei is otherwise painted as a very sympathetic character in the film. But those are not clear to me as well, what her own philosophies are. It's not even clear also what the actual anti-government movement is. I mean, there's one moment in the early part of the film, if you recall, after the early events of the film and Tetsuo is taken away, and then the group are arrested and they're brought to kind of a facility and what looks like a giant gymnasium or something, and then all the police are trying to question all these people that had arrested one at a time, and there's one of the guys that goes in and he breaks out of the police custody and he's got the grenade, right? And he says, Jiu Kakume Banzai, right? Which means, to the freedom revolution. So that seems to suggest that maybe, at least as far as he's concerned, the revolution that's being discussed here is a freedom revolution, whatever that means. So that seems to be, very far removed from this idea of tax reforms that were enacted by the former prime minister that led to this civil unrest in the country. That seems to be more of this idea of freedom versus oppression. But that isn't necessarily played out very well. We don't quite know, therefore, what Kei's own philosophy is as far as her own involvement with this revolutionary side of things. So we don't quite know about that, which I think adds to the potential confusion of this film in terms of trying to follow the plot. But I think that's what also makes it fascinating, because there are also many possibilities that can arise, many forms of interpretation as to what the plot actually means. But there is all that. And then there's also this thing of what is the government structure, right? And I think this is also very telling, because remember also in the same scene in the gymnasium, when Kaneda and Kai and the group are all arrested, the Kai is he's the guy who's the shorter guy, part of the gang. He's always seen wearing a tie, and he's one of the survivors. That he and Kei and Kaneda survive at the end, and they drive off. But he makes an off-chance comment, which is very telling. He says, he notes that the army and the police are now working together, which is something new, of course, right? Because as you know, right, the army is a very distinct body from the police, and so if they're working together, they obviously are based on different jurisdictional powers. But in this world, in this moment in time, they are working together, which could suggest something akin to, I'm not sure, martial law. It could also suggest something of maybe a difference or a change or alteration in some kind of constitutional makeup of the entire infrastructure of the country and that sort of thing. It's all unclear. But the point is, therefore, as a general proposition, the army and the military and the police are all blended into one. They are the oppressors, or they are the authoritarian side, and they are given more of an authoritarian presentation about them in the way that they mete out power, the way they abuse their power in certain instances. They go overboard in terms of how they beat up a lot of the people and that sort of thing. But I think that also adds to the sort of confusion of the story and what is all going on in terms of the politics. And therefore, that makes it very interesting, because if we have the core groups of characters that we remember, Kaneda, Tetsuo, Kei, the Colonel, let's say the three children. I'm sorry, let me take a step back. I forgot to mention the three children, Kyoko, Takashi, and Masara. So who are these people? Why are they all frail, and why do they look old and with a shriveled up skin and pale skin? What's going on here? I mean, we can of course assume that it probably has something to do with their ESP ability and the kinds of chemicals or medication that they've been on under this regime that seems to be in place under this scientific project that seems to be headed by the colonel and this doctor, who seems himself to be fascinated by trying to discover the mystery of AKIRA, whatever that means. But it has something to do with ESP, extrasensory perception, and all the powers that are associated with those abilities, those heightened abilities. Okay, so but who are they? What is their agenda, as it were? And so all the stuff, all these characters are coming together with seemingly different agendas, and it's actually very difficult to follow. Kaneda and Tetsuo have their own thing. Kei and Ryu, what is it that they're after? The colonel and the doctor and the three Espa kids, and then everyone else that's along the periphery as well. What are all of their agendas? What is it that they want? And then they all cross in a way that's sometimes very confusing. In a way that sometimes people that are at one point of the film antagonists, they can end up being maybe on the same side, as it were, by the different part of the film. Here's an example. So the colonel is, as I say, seemingly the head of this part of the government project, this scientific project that is essentially using these kids in kind of a guinea pig type of way in order to engender this ESP power among them. That's the assumption anyway. So his interests are antithetical to the interests of Ryu and Nezu-sama. So those two are on different sides of some kind of battle. Ryu, therefore, is associated with Kei, so Kei and the colonel are on opposite sides. Okay, and then by extension, Kaneda, when they infiltrate the lab around the middle of the film, they are on opposite sides, right? Because the army and the colonel the army is fighting against them, and they want to kill them. And so the army is represented by the colonel, so therefore that's a further representation of how they are on different sides. But the colonel is not the villain of the film. He is, I think, a very sympathetic person or sympathetic character in that we see him under attack from the Supreme Council, and the Supreme Council then represented by Nezu, who is on the surface seemingly this villainous looking guy. We don't spend enough time with him to understand his pure motives, but he doesn't look on the surface to be a very pleasant individual, and he is the one who is associated with Ryu, who seems to be perhaps, on the surface anyway, to be someone that we can sympathize with, but we don't quite know who we can sympathize with. And even the Colonel himself, who is on the surface to be the antagonist of characters like Kaneda and Tetsuo, ends up being a kind of hero at the end of the film, in that he tries to save the children. He tries to stop Tetsuo, even when Tetsuo is just going physically berserk with his body and all that. And this is also expressed in how the Colonel seems to look at the city. There's that wonderful, very short scene with him in the elevator with the doctor, and he's talking about how the people have lost their will to build, the joy of reconstruction is gone, and now the city is filled with hedonists, and there's a certain decadence and extravagance that disgusts him, but he still wants to save the city because that is the way of a soldier. You wouldn't understand. And his role as a military man means he must analyze the risks, and therefore he is the one that wants to save the city. He initiates his coup d'etat for the sole purpose of trying to stop Tetsuo in order to save the city. That's what he wants to do, and so he ends up becoming a very heroic figure in a very interesting way, you know. Just to make it even more confusing or more fascinating, depending on your point of view, think of it like this. Each character can also be seen as trying to show or trying to, or each character is being depicted as exercising power. The way in which these characters exercise power is one of the key foci of the film, in my humble opinion. And what do I mean by that? Each character is trying to assert himself or herself onto the scene in any way, and it's that depiction and how that affects them in an emotional and psychological way is what makes this film very interesting. So we see, for example, Kaneda trying to assert or exert his power and influence among the gang members around him, including Tetsuo. We see Tetsuo trying to literally exert his own superpower on everyone because he has a really big chip on his shoulder, and there's sort of inferiority complex that really just becomes incredibly unhealthy in terms of how the power seems to unhinge him to the point of sort of a very dangerous sense of psychosis, if you will. And then we have the Colonel exercising his power in terms of using his military control, also using his judgment in order to enact the coup, which will then lead him to a leadership position to try to save the city. And then we have other people like Nezu trying to exert his own power and influence, Ryu trying to exert his own power and influence, how that succeeds, how that fails, etc. And that is a whole big jumble of a mess. But if we take a step back, I think it becomes something that is actually very clever as far as the film is concerned, because it makes the film, therefore, on a personal level, linked very clearly to this grander theme of revolution. Because if we think of the theme of revolution as being this idea of change and this idea of upheaval and a power shift and a power struggle, we are seeing this idea of a revolution being expressed on a really individual level with almost all of the main characters, right? It's in a way a revolution of the individual spirit and how they're trying to, in his or her own way, exert power over another, and what the consequences of that exertion of power is on themselves and on the people around them and on the community environment around them. And it's a confusing thing, but I think the point is that there is I think the point of that is there is not meant to be any sort of clarity, because the answers that are generated from this sort of exposition and discussion and examination of this exercise of power are not very clean they're not very clean in terms of the answers that they pose, because I think this idea that the film is getting at ultimately is that the exercise of power is ultimately destructive. It's ultimately destructive. Now, I don't mean destructive in this is not going to make sense right now, but I don't mean it in a negative way, but I just mean it in a purely physical or terms of physics, right? The exercise of power leads to the destruction of something else. That seems to be what the film is positing. And if we think of it that way, then we see how the exercise of the power that each of these individuals wields based on his or her own character creates a kind of destruction or destructive effect on the characters around them in whatever form that is. And it's just how these characters deal with that becomes the basis of the psychological examination of each of the characters, which I find very fascinating. One of the very small, but I think a wonderful example of this is even Kay, the character of Kay. Remember when she is leaving after an explosion and I think a train station, she and Ryu are leaving the scene and they're being chased by army people. And then she and Ryu are separated, and then she goes into the sort of the kind of sewer part of the town. Kaneda follows her. Kaneda attacks one of the army people that is about to shoot Kei. And then the army guy's about to shoot Kaneda, but then Kei says, "Stop!" and he shoots him. And it's a very gruesome shot of the army guy being shot in the face, and he falls to the sewer canal, we assume to his own death. And therefore, that's an example of what I'm talking about. Is we see Kay using her power that she has, namely the power that she has of the weapon, and seeing her not only exerting that power onto another human being, not only seeing how destructive that exercise of power is, but also seeing the effect of that power on her and also on the environment around her. Because we not only see her reaction to what she has done, which is a very maybe shocked reaction that she has on her face, but also we see the destructive results of that. Namely, we linger on the dead body. We see another army guy, I think, throwing up. When we see the body, we see it, and there's nothing left for us except to linger on just how tragic the exercise of this destructive power is. And that's just an example of how this film depicts this. It lingers on the body's crunching and being damaged and being deprived of life, right? It lingers on the slow motion roll of a body that falls off a bicycle or motorcycle at the early part of the film. And it lingers on that. It lingers on poor young Kaori's face, if you remember the girlfriend of Tetsuo, after she's been beaten quite viciously by some clown members. And we get a close-up of her swollen, bloodied face, which is really quite horrific. And so that sort of thing. So this film is not only about the exercise of power, not only showing us how the power is destructive, but also shows us the results of that, not only on the psychologies of the characters that have exercised that power, but also on the people that have been affected by that power. So I find, therefore, this film to be ultimately a film that is depicting revolutionary acts, both overtly political, but also very minutely and individual. So I find this to be very fascinating. But let's also say that it's also on a plot level very confusing. But if we take a step back and think about it on a kind of thematic level, I think it becomes a very powerful depiction of this kind of, as I say, the exercise of power that leads in, of course, to a very interesting discussion, if you will, about the nature of power and energy, right? Because if we think of this idea of the exercise of power as being a destructive one, at least as depicted in this film, as I try to suggest, that creates a very interesting dichotomy, or a very interesting comparison with how AKIRA's energy is being described in the film, right? It's described as being absolute energy, and it's also being linked to this idea of the energy innate in human beings, right? The energy that is used to create things, to build things, right? To build roads and bridges and buildings and to create technologies. This is the energy upon which Akira's energy is based, at least according to Kei and Kyoko, which is an interesting way of looking at it, right? Because Akira's energy, as we see it expressed on the film, right, if we assume the first time at the very beginning that was Akira, and then the second time, which is at the end of the film, this huge ball of light that just consumes the city like a nuclear explosion, that doesn't seem to be very creative. That seems to be very negative. That seems also to be very destructive. And so we're not quite sure what that is. Although, you know, if it leads into this idea of, oh, this expression of energy is like the birth of a new universe, and it therefore becomes like a step in the evolution, the chain of evolution of humanity, and that sort of thing. I mean, that leads into a totally different discussion, I think, which I can try to talk about later in this live stream. But the point that I want to leave with you now is that it's an interesting way that this film is dealing with this idea of of energy and power and the exercise of power. Is it destructive or is it creative? People say it's creative, but in actual fact, it's being depicted as being a very destructive thing, and how the people around these events deal with that is also part of what makes this film very dramatically very powerful, but also potentially very confusing. But anyway, sorry for going off on that very long tangent. Okay, so RetroPlayer72 says, agrees with Wolfgratz, saying that this was also confusing, although it was clearer on my second watch, as you say. Jared says, I'm still resonating with the film. I understand what happened in the film, but I may be quite as well. It's a film I'll probably watch a few more times. Professor Who, hello. This is one of the few anime mostly done on ones and twos in regards to its animation. Mike Eli says, Jared, I was thinking about this as I watched it. I have mixed feelings about a live action remake. Okay, so there is the discussion of the remake. Cine Arts is here. Hello, I hope you're well, my friend. RetroPlayer72 says, I watched it in the 90s and wonder what all the hype was. Now I've seen it again. I appreciate it more. I think a few more visits may be needed for me. Let's see, and there's more discussion about the live action. Just skip over that. Okay, sorry about this. Let's see. Okay. Sorry about this. I've just skipped over a bunch of comments here. Excuse me here while I just... There we go. Glenn Gerard says the giant amoeba. Yes, that probably is a reference to Tetsuo, right? I mean, he... In that very famous speech that Kei gives in the jail cell, right, she talks about... or Kyoko, through Kei's voice, talks about how, you know, amoebas don't know how to, you know, build things or build bombs. They just know how to consume things, and so it becomes the metaphor for what the power that Tetsuo has is, and its potential destructiveness. And then, in fact, at the very end of the film, he literally becomes this flesh amoeba thing. That's I mean, the metaphor made flesh. Right, quite, you know, it actually becomes flesh. I think that's a great little trick of the film. Really well done. It's set up very nicely. So when that event occurs in the film, at the end of the film, I mean, it's, if you think about it, you know, if you just think about this action, what happens? Why does Tetsuo suddenly become this huge flesh monster at the end? It's really quite inexplicable, but actually the film has set this up so well that when the time comes at the end, this huge event in the film, I think we were already subliminally expecting it, and we know this because not only of the speech that Kei gives about the amoeba and the metaphor of the amoeba and the energy, and that's what Tetsuo is. But also we see other clues that lead to this. If you recall, when the scene when Tetsuo arm becomes so swollen and he sees it, and his cape sort of reveals his shock after he's been shot. I think it's he's been shot by Kaneda with the laser, and he falls to the ground, and Kaneda goes and he has a clean shot and he's about to shoot, but Kaneda stops and he hesitates, and he looks away from the viewfinder. He goes like this, and he sees Tetsuo, who's there alone, and Tetsuo has this look of shock on his face, right? Because he sees his arm, and his arm drops to the ground with a thud, right? If you remember, and that's a real shocking moment, because after that he becomes this huge flesh monster. But if you recall earlier in the film, when Tetsuo he escapes from the hospital after he first was admitted, there's actually some question as to whether he escaped or whether he was actually let go on purpose, but that's another question entirely. But after he escapes and he gets Kaneda's bike, he meets Kaori, he gets Kaneda's bike, and they are caught by some clown members, and poor Kaori gets beaten up, and they're about to get a real violent beating, but then Kaneda and Yamagata come just in the nick of time, and all that, and then that comes the great confrontation, one of the first of many confrontations between Kaneda and Tetsuo. That's enough. You can't order me around. That sort of thing, and then suddenly Tetsuo has these headaches, and he's seeing these visions of the ground opening up before him, and then suddenly his innards just fall with a thud to the ground. Blah, right? It's all in his mind, of course, but then you see him with his arms trying to basically gather up his insides and put them back into his body. It's a real gruesome image, but that his inner organs falling to the ground like that is very visually similar to how with a thud, the way it does the Olympic Stadium. And so I thought that was a nice little visual trick that subliminally sets us up for what we'll end up seeing later in the film with Tetsuo and the falling flesh hand, that sort of thing. And also the way Tetsuo grows into this huge, almost like baby doll. I thought that was very clever, because if you were right earlier in the film, when Tetsuo has been reapprehended and put back into this lab, and he's sleeping at night, and that's the first time we actually see him exercise some kind of ESP power. Maybe he doesn't notice it, but remember that he needs the water, and the water glass moves to his hand, and then it's at that night where he sees the little dolls, which are the projections of Takashi and Kyoko and Masaru. And they're basically dolls that have they're little dolls at first, and then they turn into huge specter dolls that are made up of little toys, and then they're huge composites of these toys that turn into these giant teddy bears, giant cars, whatever, plush toys, whatever. But I thought that was nice, because that is also subliminal setup to the giant amoeba that we'll see at the end of the film, which is this turns at one point into this huge, gigantic baby, which almost is like a baby doll, which reminded me, visually speaking anyway, as to the giant teddy bear that we saw in the middle of the film. So it's like we see the three Espas and their own projections that are these oversized toys, where at the end we see Tetsuo, and we see his own actual projection, but it's his own body, of course, but it becomes his own projection made flesh. And what is it? It's an oversized, what looks like an oversized baby doll, which is very similar to an oversized stuffed animal that we saw earlier in the film. But I thought these little setups were really nice, and how they really set us up for these real, otherwise really unbelievable moments in the film. And I think that's an example of how clever this film is. I mean, as a work of cinema, it really has a lot of tricks to it that create a kind of parallelism that also create this sense of setting things up, which give it, and also setting things up for a very satisfying conclusion later on in the film. The giant amoeba is an example of that, but another example might be, oh gosh, what's another example? Let's see. Let's see. What's another example? Oh, another example would be probably the way that dreams are used and how we see fragments of what seem to be dreams or the same dream or similar things about Kaneda and Tetsuo, and they're in the same, what is it, an orphanage, or is it is it a school? We're not quite sure. It's probably an orphanage of some kind because they were abandoned. We don't quite know exactly what the circumstances are of that, but we understand that Tetsuo, as a young boy, probably had a pretty traumatic childhood. But Kaneda too wasn't necessarily free from his own childhood trauma, we can assume as well. But there are these glimpses throughout the film of what seem to be dream sequences or dreams by Tetsuo of them in the playground that end up becoming and we're not quite sure what they mean as the film progresses, but at the end, when Kaneda is floating in the AKIRA ball of light inside, and he sees another little ball of light that grows in size and it consumes him, we realize that this is probably a dream of Tetsuo or a vision or memory of Tetsuo, and it's the memory of him as a little boy meeting Kaneda for the first time. And Tetsuo has just been basically bullied by a bunch of bullies, we assume, and maybe his doll was taken by the bullies. But then as he is alone in the park, defeated, just trying to wash his face or drink from a water fountain, we see a hand, we see him being called out. This is yours, isn't it? Right? It's a little doll, which we assume it's Tetsuo's. And we see who retrieved the doll, none other than a young Kaneda. And this is where the two young boys meet. And we see that Kaneda was not always sort of in kind of a violent or antagonistic presence in Tetsuo's life, but we can understand from this fragment at the end that in fact Kaneda was in fact a very positive presence in Tetsuo's life. At least that's one way of looking at it. And it makes the relationship therefore very poignant. And so we see that how this moment in time progresses, or another way of looking at it is we see how different perspectives can affect what seemingly is otherwise the same moment in time. And I find that really wonderful because it means that the film sets us up for something that might lead one to believe that there was some kind of bad beef between Kaneda and Tetsuo that led to the reason why Tetsuo was so angry with Kaneda to begin with. But no, we don't see that at all. On the contrary, what we see as a resolution to this plot thread, if you will, is the fact that Kaneda was so protective of Tetsuo to the point of being very caring, maybe overprotective, which was probably led to the downfall of the relationship. But ultimately, it's such a moving scene when we see the resolution of that, which is essentially how these two met as young boys. And so that's another example of how I think the film layers itself very well. And even though the film, as I explained earlier, has the potential of being quite confusing as far as all of the elements concerned, it's these little things that the film layers in quite subliminally that makes the payoffs very emotionally satisfying. And therefore, this is another way, I think, how the film makes itself very accessible, despite the fact that its plot might seem to be somewhat convoluted. So that's a reason why I think the film, as a work of cinema, is really beautifully constructed. Really beautifully constructed. But anyway, let's see. Okay. Pete 1972 is here. Hello. It's nice to see you. Hello. Okay. let's see. I'm just very just skipping over the live action discussion. It's a good discussion, very good discussion, but just skipping that just over for the sake of time here. Daniel Avila is here. Avila is here. Hello, greetings from Mexico. You say hello. It's nice to see you, Danielle. I hope you're well. Jared says, if someone yelled my name like they did in this film, I'd probably jump in surprise. Yes. Retro Player says, me too. Yes. Carl's Ransom Review says, this is one of the greatest anime films of all time. Yes, I agree. And Dinobot Curious, how are you doing? I'm good. How are you doing, my friend? Let's see. Carl's Ransom Review says, hi, Daisuke. I'm gonna get the Japanese 4K UHD version of this film. It's gonna be awesome. Yes, April 2020. Me too. But yeah, I will talk about that hopefully later in April or May. Let's see. Ben is here. Hello, my friend. I hope you're well. Let's see. Jared says, I was pretty conflicted about the Colonel. I wasn't too fond of him, particularly in the beginning, as I found him a bit arrogant at times, yet I didn't want him to die in the end, if that makes sense. No, that makes perfect sense. And actually, that's an interesting thing about the Colonel, which I think is really fascinating, because the Colonel, what was I saying? You know, like, what does he do, right? Like, okay, who is the enemy of the Colonel? Probably the biggest enemy, the biggest nemesis of the Colonel is probably Mr. Nezu. And what does Mr. Nezu do in time of crisis during the military coup? He tries to run away. He not only runs away, he tries to pack his suitcase with as much money as possible. He shoots poor Ryu in a state of confusion, and he's trying to run away with this case of cash, which ends up blowing in the wind. It really means nothing, and he dies pathetic, alone, in a dirty alley somewhere, trying to swallow desperately his medication or something like that. So what does he do in a time of crisis, Mr. Nezu? He runs away. What does the Colonel do in a time of crisis? Right at the end, when the Sol, the satellite, even the Sol cannot stop Tetsuo. What does he do? Does he run away? No, he goes right into the Olympic Stadium with a gun, just himself and a gun. It's just him. He has no backup personnel. It's just him. He could have run away. He could have done that, but he stayed to the very end. And what does he do right at the point when the monster is attacking him and it's consuming him? He says, you know, what is his concern? It's not him that he's concerned about. He's concerned about the three kids. He says, Kyoko, Takashi, Masaru, get out of here. And he turns to the monster, Tetsuo monster. He says, come on, with his gun. And then he stands his ground even as the monster is consuming him. The flesh turns into a mouth and it's about to bite his arm off or something like that. But he, you know, and even at that moment, right, if you listen to his voice, what does he say? He doesn't say, oh my gosh, he says, Kyoko, Takashi, right? He's at the very last, he's mentioning the kids' names, which is suggestive of the fact that he is thinking not of himself, he's thinking of those around him, which is exactly practicing what he preaches, right? Because if we remember, as I said earlier, if we remember what he said earlier in the film about his own philosophy, he has a kind of almost a hatred for the city, but he still has this feeling of wanting to protect it, wanting to save the city, you know, because he is a soldier. And, you know, as a military man, he must assess the risks and try to save what it is he can save. I find that very admirable, even though he is, admittedly, at many points of the film, the antagonist of the film. But I wouldn't call him the villain, because he is not villainous at all. He is very heroic, which I think is great in the way that this film presents characters. No one is two-dimensional. Everyone is three-dimensionally presented and thoroughly nuanced in a beautifully human way. And the Colonel is no exception to that. So I really like the way you described that, Jared, very much. Let's see. Okay. Just skipping. There's a discussion here about the violence aspect of this film. And that's another thing about this film that I should talk about is the violence, because this is a very violent film. I think it's not the most violent anime in the world. It's not the most disgusting thing on the face of the planet, and that's for sure. But there are some shocking scenes of violence, people dying. There's the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, moment early on in the film where one of the revolutionaries, or one of the people we assume is associated with Ryu and Kei, he is apprehended, Takashi, right, number 26, and there's a shot where he is caught by an army standoff. He seems to have run into it. I mean, the army wasn't necessarily there to follow him per se, but there was a demonstration. He just happened, unfortunately, to run into the army blockade, and he's there. He's already bleeding, and there's the gun, and then he's suddenly just shot down, not once but twice. Poor guy. And also there are some other violent scenes involving the deaths of many characters. You see stones crushing poor army soldiers. We see people getting shot in the face. We see poor Kaori. I mean, gosh, talk about a tragic character. I mean, she never had a chance in this film, but my goodness, it's just the things that she has to go through in this film, the ordeals, only to essentially be crushed in the most terrible way by Tetsuo, the giant Tetsuo monster, who couldn't even help it, who couldn't even stop it. So this is a very violent movie, but it's a film that presents, I think, violence in a very interesting way. It doesn't go overboard with the violence, and that's another interesting thing about this film. It's interesting how this film pulls back in many respects with the violence. There are some moments where we see violence very explicitly depicted on screen, but there are other moments where it's off screen. I would point your attention, for instance, to the death of Yamagata. Remember when Yamagata and Kai go to the Harukiya, and they see the bar essentially wasted and the bartender killed, and then Tetsuo is there on the heap of garbage, just laughing hysterically, and then basically subdues Yamagata to the ground. What do we see? We don't see Yamagata's death on screen, but we see a close-up, a very frightening close-up of Tetsuo and his sort of maniacal grin turning into this evil smile, and then overlay on the soundtrack, of course, is the da da soundtrack from Geino Yamashirogumi. It's a really chilling moment, and we never see Yamagata ever again. We understand that after that moment, he is gone from this world. So that's a moment where we see violence depicted off screen, or not. It's not seen. That's where violence is depicted off screen, and so it's interesting how this film both depicts violence on the one hand, but chooses moments to hold back. And I like that moment of restraint, because it's almost like we've seen what can happen with a lot of the antics and the chaos that ensues in this film. So we don't necessarily have to see every single thing that happens with this, what happens in the film and the way that Tetsuo exerts his power throughout. In other words, there are moments of violence, and then the film pulls back. And I think that goes to a general discussion about how well this film is paced. I mean, the pacing is really great in that there are moments of pure exhilaration and violence and excitement and suspense, but then they are tempered by quieter moments, character moments, maybe comedic moments, and then once again bursts of violence and an exciting moment, and then a quieter moment, and then another burst of violence. And one of the great examples I love so much is, if you recall, in the latter half of the film, Tetsuo and Kaneda have their first big battle at the end of the film. And this is where the Saw comes, and it shoots down and basically burns off Tetsuo's arm. It's an interesting thing too. I've never, how could the Saw burn off only his arm? I never quite understood that. It potentially could have just basically obliterated his entire body. It was just his arm though, but I'm not sure. But nevertheless, that first battle was very intense, but it ended up being one where Tetsuo is victorious because he ends up destroying the Saw, and the remains fall to the earth in a very solemn way. And then there's a second battle where Tetsuo is alone in the Olympic Stadium, and not only does the Colonel come to try to confront him, not only does Kaori come, but also Kaneda arrives for his own final battle. But if you recall, in between those two battles, there's this beautiful, quiet moment at night, at dusk, perhaps, where Kaneda, Kei, and Kai are together, and the batteries for the laser are being recharged by Kai's motorcycle, and then the motorcycle overcharges, or it overpowers, and it just goes into flames, and they're just laughing about it. And there's a moment where Kei is seen looking, I think it's at Kaneda, in terms, and then the fire, the bonfire is lighting up her face, and it's just a beautiful character moment. It's this quiet moment. It's lovely because it allows us to catch our breath in between these two climactic battles at the end of the film, but also it's just another character moment, because I think this is one of the moments where we can probably read into her expression that maybe she is growing, she has feelings of affection perhaps towards Kaneda that she didn't necessarily have early on in the film. If you recall, she totally rebuffed his advances, and she wasn't interested in him, although he was obviously very interested in her, sexually attracted to her and that sort of thing. But she wouldn't have any of that. But now there's a look on her face which is suggestive of the fact that maybe she has feelings for him. Now, I don't know if they're intimate feelings of intimacy or anything like that, but they are feelings that will, I think, pay off at the very end of the film, when she is trying to look for him after the city has been wasted again for the second time. And there's that wonderful moment where, when Kaneda is on the ground there, after the last piece of glowing dust, as it were, falls into his hands, and he says Tetsuo, and he's kneeling there on the ground, which is such a supremely beautiful moment. Kei is there behind him, right? And then I'll paraphrase in English, but Kaneda is there, and he says thank you, and she says, for what? And he's, you called me back, right? I heard your voice, right? So he says thank you. And that is an allusion to the point where he was still in the AKIRA glowing ball there, and we hear Kei's voice at a very key moment in that process there. So maybe we're not quite sure how he escaped the thing, and in fact, that there is a little bit of ambiguity and vagueness exactly how Kaneda escaped the AKIRA ball of energy, but we can maybe the romantic side of us might want to interpret this moment as being, maybe it was the feelings of Kei, or maybe it was something like that was able to call him back, whatever that means. And there's a lovely moment too, how that final scene plays out. If you recall, there's a close-up on Kei's face when she says, in Japanese, she says, Kaneda-kun, anata saki, which is, and then she's cut off because then Kai comes in, and we can translate that line into English as like, Kaneda, and she's about to say, back just now, there was something about you that, or something like that, and then she's cut off, and it was never explained exactly what she was about to say, which is a little bit of a weird thing. But what I interpret that moment to mean is she could have been witness to exactly how Kaneda escaped the ball, and maybe she was about to say, Kaneda, just now I saw you or something, or some kind of phenomenon that occurred, which meant that he escaped the ball of energy. I'm not sure, but that's another little detail that I find uh, very interesting, and it's almost like a secret. You know, we never find out exactly what she was going to say, but it's probably a little secret that only she and Kaneda will have. It's so secret that not even we, the audience members, will know about. And so I always like to think of it that way, and I always like to imagine in my mind that maybe that's just another indication of the growing sense of intimacy between these two characters. And in fact, when we see them last as they drive off back into the city, you know, Kei is holding on to Kaneda as he's driving off on his now damaged bike. And that's also sort of a visual cue as to perhaps the state of their relationship as we leave them and the film ends. Um, but I like the way this film is paced. You know, the quiet moments, pillowing the otherwise spectacular moments of chaos and destruction that this film has. And believe me, there are a lot of scenes of chaos and destruction, so much so that it becomes almost overwhelming. It's an overwhelming assault on the senses, as one review that I read about it stated about that. And I think that's great, because it is not only a science fiction film, but it's also a disaster film, a really great disaster film, and it's also a human drama film. It's all of humongous, heightened drama, operatic proportions, and everything in between. So, on that basis, I think the way it's paced, giving us time to breathe, I think is really great. Another great scene like that is after Tetsuo escapes for the first time, and where does he go first? He goes to Kaori's dormitory or something, and there's a moment where it's just the two of them, and he's drinking like a can of Coke, and he just throws it away, and it's just the two of them sitting there, and he says, you know, let's just go away, and he says, and let's go away somewhere, and Kaori says, somewhere? Where do we go? And then it cuts to a shot of the two of them as they're leaning against this wire fence, and just the camera, right? The shot pulls back, and it says, you know, just and then Tetsuo says, just somewhere, anywhere, you know, somewhere far away, and just cuts back, and we get a subtle yet beautiful burst of the Geino Yamashiro Gumi music again. That's really wonderful, and that's a kind of character moment that I really love. It's just, there's a real quiet comfort that these two characters have with each other, and it's very brief, but it's so evocative and illustrative of what kind of relationship that they have, or they seem to have, and that makes the scenes later in the film, how their relationship is tested in two very violent ways that both lead to Kaori's injury or death. That makes those scenes even more poignant and tragic. And so I find that those quiet moments of the film, those two examples that I just gave, being examples, I really add a lovely, tender, almost tragic dimension to the film that would not otherwise be there had those scenes not been included. So, yeah, so that is another reason why I think this film is great in terms of its as a work of cinematic art. It's also paced quite brilliantly. So, okay, let's see. Okay. Okay. Ultron Kaiju is here. Hello. Hello, it's nice to see you. Let's see. Okay, there's more discussion here about the live action. Alan says, I wonder as I watched the film what was happening in Japan culturally at the time, the manga and film that influenced its creator. I mean, I don't know about that necessarily, but I mean, this was the early to mid 80s. And so there is this idea of economic growth, but you know, the Japanese economy and economic growth. And we see kind of that in the film, the way in which you know, Japan is growing, even in the wake of ultimate destruction. And this is one of the great, not great, but this is one of the most powerfully depicted ways of treating the concept of Japan in a metaphorical sense after the end of the Second World War, of course. And there are many post-war economic boom types of links that I think are very evident in the film. For one thing, the concept of AKIRA and the energy ball that destroys Tokyo at the very beginning and also destroys Neo-Tokyo, or at least part of Neo-Tokyo, or the old city of Neo-Tokyo. I'm not sure exactly what part. I think it's part of the Neo-Tokyo. It's not the entirety, but there is a big destruction in the wake of that. It's very reminiscent of a nuclear bomb, which of course recalls the atom bomb and Japan's relationship with the atom bomb. And then also this idea of genes and cells and cellular structure and things breaking down to the atomic level, and how things are like split, and sort of that sort of theme that we see in the film is also reminiscent of the atom bomb, right? The release of the energy upon the splitting of the atom. Even inside, well, yeah, okay, so that is obviously a link to a kind of post-war Japan concern, at least in the way in which Japan is depicted in literary terms or cinematic terms, for sure, or poetic terms, perhaps. There's also this idea of an economic boom. We see a Tokyo that is decadent, that is, there are pockets that are obviously very wealthy, but there are also pockets that are not so wealthy. There is a subtle class distinction that is being made here, although I wouldn't necessarily call it very pronounced. But there does seem to be a kind of class distinction that could be made in terms of how we see the anti-government forces on the one hand, and then the government forces and the government bureaucracy on the other hand. Although I don't want to put too much emphasis on that point. There have also been some commentary, not by me, but by other reviewers and critics who have discussed this film. I'm looking, for instance, about Tetsuo, the character himself, and how he seems to be representing a kind of depiction of post-war Japan, like an overgrowing Japan that seems to be collapsing under its own weight, as it were. And we can see the follow-through of that later on, in terms of kind of economic downturns that affected the Japanese economy later on, and even now presently. But as a kind of post-war metaphor, or not metaphor, but as a metaphor for economic growth of Japan in the post-war era, some people see Tetsuo as that kind of metaphor. I kind of buy that, but I think it's a little bit. I don't think that's I think a very good reading, but I don't think that's the only reading of Tetsuo. Let me put it that way. But so yeah, so that is just I think those are examples of how this film is very timely to the time that it was made. Although I should mention also that it's very interesting to watch the film now, because there are discussions about reconstruction of the metropolis, this idea of rebuilding cities, great cities. There's also this idea of getting ready for the Olympics. And as some of you may know, as of now, Japan, or Tokyo, is trying to get itself ready for the Olympics. And there have been, over the past several years, there have been many issues as far as budgets and infrastructure spending and construction, and issues surrounding that sort of thing, and Olympics preparedness. And even now, new issues arise even now about, well, I don't want to get into too many details, but it's very interesting to see certain parallels perhaps in what we see in the film Akira and what we are experiencing now in real time in Tokyo in terms of Olympic preparedness and the like. I'd like to think, of course, that in real life we won't see any rise of any Tetsuo-like figure that will go into the Olympic Stadium and turn into this a giant flesh amoeba. But the point is that it's interesting to see how these elements that we saw depicted in this film, which is set in 2019, are not actually so far removed from what we are actually experiencing in Tokyo right now. So it's a very interesting way in which Katsuhiro Otomo, the filmmaker, prophesies what was going to happen. His powers of his precognitive powers rival almost those of Kyoko's in the film in an interesting way, perhaps. But there's that. Also, this idea of reconstruction and reconstruction, or the joy of reconstruction giving way to this feeling of decadence and hedonism, I think is one. If one looks hard enough, one could find parallels to the modern day in terms of reconstruction of parts of Japan that are still quite savaged from the destruction of, for example, the great earthquake and tsunami disaster of March 2011, and so. And then there's this idea of reconstruction, trying to reconstruct part of Japan in terms of application of taxes and allocation of building materials, etc. But this issue of reconstruction is still one that is not completely far removed from the present day, and so I find this film to be very prescient or still quite relevant, and I find it's very relevant, surprisingly relevant even now, as I watch it in 2020. So it's an amazing document, as well as being a very entertaining and amazing film. So, and there are many connections to Japan, past and present, that are quite remarkable. Okay, let's see. Just keeping going here. Trey Edwards is here. Hello. And Jay Betty is here. Hello. Let's see. Okay, Alan says, the one frustration with the film is with the withered children. So that's Takashi, Kyoko, and Masaru. In half sentences, they hint at something, at a becoming, and a hint at their purpose, but it's never fully played out. And Pete 1972 says, Alan, it's probably explained more in the manga. It is interesting in the film because you do want to know about them. The kind of vagueness does give it sort of a mysterious quality. Yeah, I would agree with Pete 1972 on that as well, although I completely sympathize with Alan's comment. We don't quite know what the heck they're talking about for a lot of the time. I don't quite know what it means, but and even their backgrounds too are a little bit mysterious. Masaru. Here's an example. Masaru. Why was Masaru handicapped like that? It's not quite clear, because if you recall, in one of the early flashback scenes that Kaneda witnesses in the end of the film, we see a flashback of this bus going to this facility, and we see what we assume to be the young Kyoko, Takashi, and Masaru, and Akira is there as well. But this is before and after they have been experimented upon, and before we see them in some kind of government lab. Maybe they're talking with scientists. During that scene, if you recall, Masaru is seen walking down a hallway, and he's seen creeping up into a room that has the number 28 on it, and we see him look into a room, and we see someone rising from the bed, which we assume is Akira. And then some shots later, we see the three kids with kind of caps on their heads. We assume that maybe their heads have been shaved and their brains have been operated on or something. And so they are now in a state of post-surgical recovery. And part of that is we see now that they're exhibiting these ESP powers. And one of the powers is, we assume, the one child, which we assume is Masaru, is the one sitting in front of the TV, and we see the TV images swirl, which we assume is due to his mind power control or something. And he's sitting down, and we see crutches leaning against the table there. So that's an interesting thing. I don't quite know why he suddenly becomes injured like that, to the point where now, of course, he is seen in a kind of floating wheelchair. So that's an interesting little mystery that the film doesn't necessarily solve. But there is a shot of Masaru actually walking, so maybe it's not quite. I'm not quite sure what that is. Maybe the operation, or maybe his mind powers meant that his physical condition deteriorated quite significantly, or something to that effect. Maybe he was ill prior to the surgery. I'm not sure, but I bring that up because there are many things about the children that are left completely unexplained. It's not quite sure exactly what's going on. And even in that little flashback scene, you remember the TV exploded? Who caused that explosion? Was it AKIRA? Was it Masaru? I'm not quite sure. The scene seems to end in a way that's suggestive of the fact that maybe it was AKIRA who did it, but it's still not clear because it was Masaru who's watching the TV, so I'm not sure. So what was my point? So yes, so even many things about the children, even if one tries to look at it, are very, even now, quite inexplicable. And even their purpose seems a little bit inexplicable in itself, right? So for example, what was the reason for them wanting to attack Tetsuo that first time with the teddy bear, rabbit, and the car doll appearances, and attacking him with milk? And what was the whole point of that? It doesn't necessarily seem to be very effective in terms of, if you want to subdue Tetsuo. Was it some kind of psychological ploy? Was it a rite of passage? I'm not sure what that was. But it was something that seems to be very, as a visual moment and very shocking moment in the film. I think it works very well as a moment of surprise. But as a kind of strategy or technique to try to stop Tetsuo, I can't even now see the strategic effect or the strategic worth of that kind of strategies to try to battle against Tetsuo. It doesn't seem to make sense to me, but at least in the context of the film. And so that's an example of things where there are things left mysterious as far as specific details. As far as their philosophies, we don't even know what it is they want. Takashi, if you recall, does he really like this stuff or not? He seems to be the most, how should I put it, not rebellious of the three, but he seems to be the one that has the most, he seems to be the one that is not like the other two. Remember, he is the one that is seen being abducted, or he is escaping at the beginning of the film. I'm not sure which it is. Maybe it's a little bit of both. He doesn't seem to want to resist, so he seems to be wanting to run away too. So maybe there's this feeling of him wanting to get the heck out of there as well. Kyoko, or I'm sorry, to follow through with Takashi. And if you recall, it's Takashi at the very end who first makes the decision to jump into the ball of energy in order to save Kaneda. So he's the first one to exhibit a kind of gesture of self-sacrifice that Kyoko and Masaru actually try to get him or convince him to not do. So in fact, Masaru and Kyoko at first don't want to sacrifice themselves, but maybe in seeing how Takashi very selflessly gives himself to the energy, that the two of them decide to stick together as three, and so then they decide to sacrifice themselves as well. So Takashi seems to have a almost independent streak about him when compared to the other two children. Masaru has a kind of he's a well actually speaking of the when I spoke earlier about the tactic that the three kids used with the dolls, the giant dolls, it's like what was their purpose? And I suggested maybe it was a rite of passage or something like that. But if you recall, very soon after, when Tetsuo actually goes into the baby room, what's described earlier by one of the politicians as the grotesque kindergarten, that it's an interesting thing where Masaru actually attacks Tetsuo and throws him against the wall. If you recall what he says die, shinjae, or die. So he says, you know, I want you to die, which if we take that to really mean what he's saying, he really wants to kill him. And so you don't necessarily say that in jest or anything like that. So that seems to suggest that maybe they had a very their strategy was to inflict some kind of harm on Tetsuo from the very beginning. And if that's the case, then that makes their choice of dressing up as giant dolls even more inexplicable. So that's an interesting little thing. But maybe it can be explained by the fact that they are still only children, and you know they are scared by the sight of blood. At least Kyoko and Takashi are, and so that's probably goes a long way in trying to explain the decisions that they make throughout the film. Anyway, but there are moments of what is Kyoko's goal? What does she want to do? She talks about trying to harness or trying to control this power, but not necessarily being able to now. But maybe they will one day, and in fact, it has already begun for them now as well. So there's this idea of control. But control doesn't necessarily have to be this evil thing. Maybe if it's this idea of the government wanting to control the power, maybe it could be seen as being an evil thing. But with them, I'm not quite sure. It's still quite ambiguous. But if you recall, at the moment when Tetsuo infiltrates room A1, the baby room in the lab, and he confronts the three children, and you know, he is really exhibiting the height of his powers. And as he is laughing maniacally, Kyoko is seen floating in space, and she says, you know, stop it. Don't cause any harm to any other people anymore. Don't hurt anyone else anymore. So that line alone seems to suggest to me that Kyoko, at least she seems to be exhibiting a kind of, not necessarily pacifist philosophy, but she seems to be exhibiting a philosophy of not wanting to harm others. And so that's why she's urging Tetsuo to stop. Although that seems to go against the choice that she seems to be making with respect to Kei. If you recall, Kei has some kind of psychic ability of some sort. We don't quite know why or how, but the assumption is that she has a kind of ability to the extent that it causes Kyoko to have a kind of psychic link with her. And it also compels her, Kyoko, and the other two kids to want to use Kei as part of their means to try to stop Tetsuo. And if you think about that, that seems to be a little bit antithetical to Kyoko's earlier proclamation of don't hurt anyone. Because if by the very fact that she is using Kei in order to try to stop Tetsuo, just as Tetsuo is about to infiltrate the cryogenic chamber of AKIRA, underneath the Olympic Stadium, Kei emerges and they enter into a battle, Kei and Tetsuo, if you recall. And we assume that that's the three children somehow possessing Kei and fighting Tetsuo through the body of Kei or something like that. If we think of it like that, right? The children's positions become a little bit less sympathetic in my eyes because they are using another human in order to try to stop Tetsuo, perhaps at the risk of harming said human. And so, fortunately, Kei doesn't seem to have sustained any permanent physical injuries, but all the same, their tactics, the three children's tactics vis-a-vis Kei, seem to be a little bit potentially disingenuous. But even so, even if one looks at it as being like, you know, it's the unavoidable use of force in order to protect oneself principle, then I think it's very justifiable, of course. And I don't necessarily think of the three children as being villainous, but I'm just saying that their philosophies aren't necessarily completely, how should I put it, pacifist. They are quite complicated, and they do involve the reliance on the exercise of physical force in order to try to achieve their objectives. And so I love that, because it means that they aren't necessarily all good or all bad. Even though I think they are meant ultimately to be seen as being some kind of source of knowledge or information as to what this power is and what it means for humanity and how to stop it and that sort of thing. Which is also great too, because it also leads to AKIRA and what AKIRA represents. You know, there's this notion about AKIRA being like a god or being this deity. There's also like a religious cult that has erupted around this idea of AKIRA and what he means. And even when he finally emerges at the end, and the vials of stuff break, and then he emerges from the mist just in time to meet the three kids, there is a sense of him being a kind of figure of peace or calm or tranquility, which I think is very beautiful and is very befitting, because AKIRA is seen as this almost godlike figure. But also keep in mind that the way that AKIRA exercises his energy is ultimately destructive, right? Because we see the destruction of the city not once but twice. And so query whether AKIRA as a concept or character or idea as expressed in this particular film can be really said to be all tranquil and all calm and all peaceful. Even when the Geino Yamashiro Gumi music seems to suggest a kind of calm, peaceful tranquility, we are seeing on screen the destruction of the city and also the deaths of people, or at least the death of one person, anyway, the doctor, and that really memorable scene of him in the little lab just suddenly getting crushed to death. But what was I saying? So there is a kind of complexity being painted in terms of what these kids represent, and are they really all benevolent? Are they meant to be seen as being all benevolent, or maybe are there shades of complexity and nuance to that? And I think that comes back ultimately to this notion that I was trying to bring up earlier in the live stream, which is how this film in many facets and on many levels seems to be trying to depict this notion of the exercise of power and the way in which that exercise of power can lead to destruction. And I think the kids and also AKIRA as well, if we include him in the kids, the group of kids, I think that's another expression of this as the film is depicting it. And therefore, I find the depiction of the kids, as ambivalent as it is, to be very fascinating, and I think still quite consistent with how the rest of the film plays out. Hopefully that makes sense, but yeah, let's see. Okay, so let's see. Just skipping around. Jared says the music is fantastic. I'd like to get the soundtrack one day. Pete 1972 says to Alan, the music perfectly complements the bizarre nihilistic world of AKIRA. Yeah, the music is really great. Nihilist, I'm not sure if nihilistic is, I kind of see where you're going. I'm not sure if maybe, well, I don't want, let me disregard that for a second, but let me talk about the music. So the music is credited as being by Geino Yamashiro Gumi, and it's I think one of the best soundtracks ever. and not just of any anime, but of any film ever. It's incredibly timeless. It's quite clever in that it goes for the opposite of what might expect in a science fiction film. It doesn't go for the kinds of obvious synthesizer, science fiction-y type of sound. It goes instead for a more like a traditional sound, if you will, using traditional instruments and also the human voice, which seems to be sort of a hallmark, if you will, of this music group style. And it's really wonderful for it. It makes the film very timeless. I love it too because the use of instruments and sounds gives the film, and especially the way in which the percussion, the beats, the percussion is driving the themes with the kinds of instrumentals that are used. It gives the film a kind of, it sounds like it's using or relying upon a sensibility of traditional Japanese folk music on the one hand, but also music that is used in like Japanese festivals and matsuri and that sort of thing. That is also being helped, incidentally, by the sort of lyrics that you hear as the music is playing. Case in point, one example is at the very beginning of the film with the bike chase and the bikers, the Kaneda's group and the clowns. At the very, very beginning, the very famous theme of Akira. It's actually, I think, on the soundtrack. It's called Kaneda. It's the Kaneda theme, and it's the dun 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 dun. Right? It also carries through, I think, to the closing credits. I'm not sure if any of the English Blu-ray releases of the film Akira have done this, but hopefully it has. But if not, just for your information, there are lyrics on that song that you're heard even as the film is being played, and if you look online, I'm sure you can find the lyrics to that song. Just type in Akira 1988 anime and lyrics, and I'm sure it'll come up, and you can find maybe a site that'll give you the lyrics. But that's giving us words of things like from memory. Let's see, arashi, hikari, hono, or tatsumaki. So like those words are things in nature, like light and storm and tornado, matsuri, which is like festival. And so these are just random words that are being shown, but they seem to be words that are linked to either Japanese folklore or imagery or things found in nature. And then we also hear names that are being spoken by the chorus of the song. Kaneda, Tetsuo, Kai, I think Yamagata. So these are the names of the people, the characters in the film. So they are singing out the names as we are listening to the song, and it's almost subliminal, but it's really quite lovely. And I'm not sure if any of the English Blu-rays somehow subtitle those, but if they don't, that's a shame, because they really should. There should be maybe a supplement somewhere. If it doesn't exist, hopefully it will one day soon, but it would be a great supplement to have the songs actually analyzed and see exactly what they're saying. The same is true for what's called the Requiem track, which is a very long track. It's quite complicated, but a part of the ending of that track is used as sort of the ending theme of the film, after Kaneda has escaped from the ball of energy and the thing falls, and we hear that calming, sort of choral, calming music, and everything is now at rest. And what's being spoken is actually the words nemure, akira, akira nemure, nemure, akira nemure. So that means go to sleep, akira, go to sleep. And it says, it also says, nemure tetsuo, and it says nemure kodomo no minna nemure. So it says, tetsuo, go to sleep, go to sleep. And it says, all the children, go to sleep, go to sleep. And so it's very fitting, because that's the end of the film, and that's where everything has now reached a conclusion. Now things are going to go to sleep, and in fact, Akira has gone to sleep, Tetsuo has gone to sleep, the children have gone to sleep. And that's the end of the film. And so I find the music to be not only very thrilling with a pulse-driven percussion, of course, but the lyrics that are overlaid by the beautiful choral work of Geino Yamashiro Gumi just give the film an extra edge. And so it's almost speaking to the film and to the themes of the film as they are being played out in real time as we watch the film. Incidentally, this is a good time for me to mention the Japanese version of the film as being made available on various Blu-ray releases or DVD releases over time. There is the original unrestored 2.0 mix. And then I think there are two 5.1 surround mixes, at least one, I think maybe two, and there's one in particular, the most recent one I understand being from 2008 to 2009, 5.1 surround mix of the film. I'm talking about the soundtrack, the audio track of the film, the Japanese version, and I have to say that speaking of the music. The really new restored 5.1 surround mix of the film has differences in the music that makes some of the musical choices, how should I put it, it really, in some places the changes I think are very minor. But there's one instance where the change is actually quite significant to the point where I don't really like the new musical choice of the new 5.1 stereo mix. Okay, so some of the changes are quite minor in my opinion anyway. The new 5.1 stereo mix somehow brings out some of the background aspects of the music that were otherwise inaudible or not at all heard on the original 2.0 mix. And I think that's fine. I don't mind that at all. There's also a moment where, if you recall, in the baby room scene when Tetsuo confronts the three kids in the lab baby room scene, and they have a little, it's Takashi and Masaru are standing in front of the glass-domed crib of Kyoko, and Tetsuo comes in and they have a little psychic battle. Takashi and Masaru on the one hand and Tetsuo on the other, and they have a little psychic battle. And on the 2.0 mix, the original mix, you just heard like like a kind of like a vibrating sound of some sort. In the new 5.1 surround mix, you actually hear like I don't know what it is, but it's like Japanese folk instruments that are almost like matsuri. Japanese festival folk music that's overlaid onto the soundtrack for some inexplicable reason. I'm not quite sure why, but it that actually enhances the scene in a very interesting way. It gives it it gives it a nice sort of Japanese folk tale type of feel to it, if that makes any sense. So I don't mind that particular change at all. But there is one change that is really, in my eyes, just totally baffling to me. At the very end, when Kaneda enters the ball of energy, there's a moment of silence, if you recall, and he's flying through the whiteness, and he lands on a little piece of road debris, and he just lands there, and then suddenly there's a little ball that grows in size, and there's a sound of sort of a shiny sound, and then we cut to Kaneda's face, and the white light consumes him, and he says Tetsuo, and it brings him to the memory of when Tetsuo and Kaneda as kids first met in the park. In the original 2.0 mix, and in fact, in the original 2.0 mix of the English version, and also the subsequent 5.1 English version dub that was made in the early 2000s, the music that was used for that particular scene was the part of the Requiem at the end that I quoted, which was the calming Nemure, Nemure, Akira, Nemure. So that's the music that's used also at the very end of the film when the little dust falls and then Kaneda grabs it and he says, Tetsuo. That's that same music that's used in this memory moment of the little kids meeting for the first time. And I thought that was so beautiful and poignant and really lovely because it really highlights just how tranquil and how innocent and how touching the moment that these two kids met for the first time really is. Because it's not only the moment that will change the lives, these two lives forever, but it's also the moment where we realize that Kaneda was really caring about Tetsuo to the point that he would go and beat up all these bullies just to get Tetsuo's doll back. And what a beautiful moment, and it's a moment of connection between the two of them, and it's also showing Tetsuo's vulnerability and his willingness to be with Kaneda, and also showing Kaneda how much he cares about Tetsuo. And over that scene, we had this lovely, calming music that just really punctuated the scene perfectly in my eyes. Well, in the new 5.1 Japanese restored soundtrack, audio mix, that scene has new music. And it's the music which is kind of, if you know the soundtrack of AKIRA, there's the track Requiem, which is this long track. I think it's about 10 minutes or so, if I recall, maybe more. And it's filled with a lot of different musical tones, sometimes calming, sometimes percussion beats. There's a moment in the middle that's actually an organ piece. And you hear part of the organ piece actually later in the film, or in that sequence, when we hear the organ and the light consuming the city and all that. It's sort of this fugue type of thing. Well, on this memory scene between the two kids, we have the sort of introductory element of that organ part of that soundtrack that is used as the music for this scene now, instead of the more tranquil and calming a lovely sort of calming choral bit that was used in the original 2.0 Japanese mix. And I find that choice to be somewhat a shame, because the organ just gives the scene a little bit. It still gives the scene a sense of emotional weight, but it's a different kind of emotional weight. There isn't any sense of. It's sort of a, how should they put it? The organ gives it an overdose of slight sadness or tragedy that I think is a little bit too overblown. I think the earlier use of music, or the music in the earlier 2.0 unaltered, the original mix, is actually much better and much more subtle and poignant than the organ music that is used in the newer Japanese 5.1 surround track. And I think that's just one change, but that change alone is enough for me to always want to stick with the earlier Japanese mix of the film rather than the newer Japanese mix of the film. Even as much as I think the newer Japanese mix of the film is really quite good, the older one surpasses it in my eyes for that scene alone. I mean, that scene alone is one of the most powerful moments in the film. It really is one of the moments, and it's also wonderful. It's so wonderful too because it's that same music that's used at the very end when the thing falls and Kaneda grabs it in his arms and he says Tetsuo. It's the use of that music in both scenes that links those two scenes so beautifully, and it's like the Kaneda and Tetsuo meeting for the first time as kids, and it's the scene at the end where they are saying, in a sense, Kaneda saying goodbye to Tetsuo. And the same music is used. It's so perfect, and they changed it for the new 5.1 restored Japanese track. It's not my decision, of course, but oh well. I'm sure maybe over time I might get to like the newer 5.1 surround Japanese track of it. But but for now, I'll stick to the original 2.0 track for that scene alone. Even now, thinking about it, it's very emotional, and I don't feel that sense of emotion when I recall the way in which it's played out in the newer 5.1 mix, the Japanese mix of the film. Okay, so and I did have those soundtracks, by the way. I don't have any more because I just played them too much and the CDs got damaged. But I did have what was it? It was the American or the North American CD soundtrack of it and the Japanese CD soundtrack of it. And actually, I prefer the North American release more than the Japanese release, because the Japanese, it had that thing where it had musical tracks and it had like pieces of dialogue and things edited on or something like that. It wasn't. It was okay, but I preferred the tracks themselves, and really great. That Requiem piece is just phenomenally emotional. Really, if you can find that soundtrack, I recommend it wholeheartedly. Okay, let's see. I'm going to have to start winding down. Let's see. Okay. It's almost, oh gosh, I've been talking for about almost 2.5 hours. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, there's talk about the soundtrack. It's really good. Really good. Fred Hamilton says, I never seen an anime such as AKIRA that's received a spectacular HD treatment in its 25th anniversary Blu-ray release. AKIRA truly pops in all its glory with the neon and layered backgrounds. Yeah, that's a good point, and I should say also, that reminds me, it's also really a key film in terms of the animation and the anime. Based on this is my own very basic understanding, but apparently at this time, this was quite a groundbreaking film, at least according to Katsura Otomo, because first of all, he emphasized the use of orange in the night scenes. This is according to part of his interview that's found on the AKIRA production report, which is also a great visual document of the making of the film. If you can find that, I recommend that wholeheartedly. But in that production report, he emphasized the use of orange for night scenes, which was apparently kind of a revolutionary thing at the time. Also, this is very important, the mouth movements of the characters matches the Japanese phonetics of the lines in Japanese as they're saying them, because Japanese it operates on a sort of a phonetical sound range that is essentially 5 sounds, a, I, u, e, o, right? And if you can see the way my mouth moves, a, I, u, e, o, you can see my mouth it widens, or it closes, or something like that. Well, and then all the words in Japanese are essentially patterned after these sounds, like a, or sa, or ta, or something, or ka, and then these sounds follow through with the different sort of consonants that are combined to form Japanese words. Well, the film, I'm sure many of you know this already, but the way that the mouths on the characters move match these phonetical sounds in Japanese. So when a character says Kyoko, the way the mouth will move will actually match that, right? Which is at the time quite groundbreaking and very, very groundbreaking for an animation film. It meant that the dialogue had to be recorded prior to the animation, that's my understanding, and then the animation had to match the dialogue as it was recorded and spoken during the time of recording. So this is quite a revolutionary thing at the time. And so if you watch the Japanese version, and if you look at the way that the mouths of the characters moves, you can see that they match, which is there's a great line, or at the very least, look at the trailer, the Japanese trailer. There's a line that I loved when I first saw it on the trailer in Japanese when I was a kid, and I couldn't believe how cool it was, how the mouths matched the dialogue. There's a scene at the middle where after the clowns attacked Tetsuo and Kaori, Kaneda comes and he says, "Mo yose Tetsuo, korosuki ka?" And that means, stop it, Tetsuo. Do you really want to kill him? And that's after Tetsuo's really beating up on one of the clowns. And you can see Kaneda's mouth says, korosuki ka, right? So you can see his mouth move, and it matches exactly what the words he says. So I thought that was so cool when I first saw it. And it was just groundbreaking, absolutely groundbreaking. So that's one of the joys of watching this film in the Japanese version. You can catch these little moments. And also, let me just follow through with this discussion too. There are some things about the Japanese that might get lost in translation sometimes. One of these being some of the lyrics that you can hear on some of the Geino Yamashiro Gumi music tracks that actually speak words or names that are significant to the plot. There are also some moments in the film that I think are quite Japanese in terms of reliance on Japanese language. One example is the way in which names are said. In Japanese, it's very customary to say someone else's name and adding something at the end of it, like something called a san or kun or something, which is suggestive of one's view or attitude or perception of that person as he or she relates to you, your sort of social hierarchical relationship. So for the one that I think is most recognizable to non-Japanese speakers would be san. So sometimes people will say, like, if someone's like Tanaka-san or Miyagi-san or something like that, which is an honorific, right? So those are usually attached to the ends of names as you speak them. Usually the last name, but not uncommonly also the first name. So for instance, my first name is Daisuke. So sometimes people very, very kindly address me as Daisuke-san. It's quite unnecessary, of course, but people address me like that sometimes as a way of trying to show a kind of honorific. You would never refer to yourself as with the son, honorific, of course, but so in that example, I wasn't referring to myself. I was just trying to give an example of what some people call me on occasion. But the point is that these sort of honorifics or these things that are attached to the ends of names, it's actually quite a big deal in Japanese language culture. And so there's one thing it's called chan. So sometimes as a kind of cutesy nickname, people will call, like, one of my nicknames in Japanese is Dai-chan. It's not Daisuke, but Dai-chan. So sometimes people call me Dai-chan as a kind of cutesy nickname, and which I don't mind at all. But that's also something where you can call like someone that's younger than you. Sometimes something with a chan on it. You wouldn't call someone that's younger than you with something san usually. Sometimes the word kun is used, and that sort of thing. So the point here is that in the film, people sometimes use the way that people call other people is very significant. I should say one other thing. There's one other instance where you can call people by their names without using any of these san or kun or chan um, uh, suffixes at the ends of names, and those non-suffixed name calling is generally used for family or for really, really close relationships. So, for instance, to um, if I'm talking to my wife or about my wife, I wouldn't necessarily use that because it's not appropriate. And when I'm talking to someone else about my wife, I wouldn't refer to my wife with the son honorific because that wouldn't be appropriate. So there are all these rules that exist in the Japanese language, just with the use of san or kun alone. In this film, that is actually quite significant because, for the most part, for example, the Kaneda and Tetsuo never refer to each other as as Kaneda-san or Tetsuo-kun or Tetsuo-chan or something like that. There's one moment in the film where, after Tetsuo has gained his powers, he's really mocking Kaneda, and he's saying, what does he say? He's in English. The line can be translated in English. You don't have to help me anymore, Kaneda. In fact, I think from now on, it is I who will be helping you. And then he says in Japanese to end that, he says, "Son toki wa ii na, Kane-chan yo." And then so he calls Kaneda Kane-chan. So he takes the first part of his name, Kaneda, which is Kane, and he adds chan to it. And that's really insulting. And you can tell after he says Kane-chan yo, and then Kaneda's reaction is really, he is so angry at that point. And that's that's essentially Tetsuo really spitting in Kaneda's face at that moment. There's another moment later on in the film where they're talking, one of these grandiose speeches from Tetsuo, and in fact Kaneda makes a point and says, "When you call my name, you better call me Kaneda-san," or something like that. And he says, and that's an actual direct reference to that, which I think is really quite fascinating. Incidentally, up to then, they never call each other san or chan. They always call each other just Tetsuo or Kaneda, even in the Japanese. So that in and of itself is suggestive of their intimate relationship and how close they are. They're almost like brothers, and that sort of thing. So I find the way in which the names themselves are spoken among the characters to be very indicative of how social hierarchical concepts are expressed even in how one says the name of another in the Japanese language. And that is very, very significant in this film. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the name calling, which I think has become almost meme-like in itself in today's age, I think it's still very significant because it's almost in a way calling attention to how people, these rules about how people call other people's names in the Japanese language. And so when I hear Kaneda, Tetsuo, and all this stuff, that really reminds me of that. And that even this calling out of Kaneda, Tetsuo, those acts themselves, I think, are so wonderfully and beautifully paradoxical, because they are being called out in moments of anger and great hatred towards the other. Tetsuo, that sort of thing. Like as he says, as he's about to throw a rock on him or something like that. So they're said in moments of great anger, but so they can be said to be the height of it's like the ultimate way of trying to insult someone by saying someone's name is to not have an honorific attached to it where it should otherwise have been attached. So on the one hand, those screaming outs of Kaneda, Tetsuo are like, I'm insulting you. But at the same time, they are also indications of their intimacy and their closeness, because as brothers or as real comrades do, they don't need these honorifics to call each other because they love each other so much. And so I love those, the way they scream out the names Tetsuo and Kaneda, because even in those moments, those are like love-hate call-outs of the names of the other. And so even those sort of iconic, almost meme-like moments of the film, I think, are filled with a lot of meaning. And it perhaps well, that's one of the reasons why I think it's such a rich and rewarding experience to watch this, for me anyway, in the Japanese language. Although, let me end with just saying that I do admire very, very much the two English versions that I've seen, the English dub versions that I've seen. I see nothing wrong with those. You know, there are some issues of translation, of course, but those are, I think, very forgivable and very understandable, and they don't break the flow of the story as they're being told in the respective English dub versions. So I'm talking about the earlier streamlined version, and then the later new release English dub version from the early 2000s. They're both different, but very recommendable. So I really love those very much. And I've seen them a number of times. The earlier one I've seen more than the later one, of course, but they're both very recommendable, and I like them both very much. Okay, so now let me just slowly wind down. Let's see. Okay. Jared says, Akira seems to be an entity of both grace and destruction. That's a good way of putting it. He's quite interesting. Very, very good way of putting it. Yes, J. BD continues. Akira is like a god with both healing and destruction abilities in one. That's really great. Let's see. Glenn Gerard says also Indonesian gamelan music. Yes, I think that's I read that. I think it's mentioned on the Wikipedia page also. I'm not an expert in Indonesian gamelan music, but I have read that description when talking about the Geino Yamashirogumi music. It also meant, yeah, then Alan also refers to no musical element. It's, I think also the Wikipedia page on Geino Yamashirogumi also mentions no musical performance. I don't want to go into no theater very much. Some aspects of it are like no theater, in my opinion. I'm not an expert in no theater, but some aspects are, especially towards the beginning, but not all aspects. So that's why I use the term, very generally speaking, folk music. Some aspects are like no theater, but not all aspects. Maybe, yeah. Maybe that can be a discussion for another day. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, Glenn Jarrett says the boom of Requiem is actually the starting sound of the film. Yes, you're referring to the track of the Requiem, which begins with the boom, and it has different elements throughout. But the boom of the start of that track is the actual start of the film, and then it actually goes into many different musical territories. I love that track, by the way, the Requiem track. It's really wonderful. Okay. All right. Let's see. Yes. Okay, just going through here. Alan says, I noticed the differences in the music from the mixes. Yes. Razor Wire reviews Tetsuo, Kaneda. Ivy Scar says, how does the film club work? Yeah, just you can show up and you can stay as long as you want, and you can leave a comment, or you don't have to. So we just pick a film, or a film is chosen, and we just talk about it. Glenn says, Tetsuo's main gripe with Kaneda is, I think, Kaneda's playfulness, childishness on the one hand, and Kaneda's strength to save to ride a motorbike on the other, as if Kaneda does not appreciate power. As if he doesn't appreciate power. That's very interesting. Although, would I call it something that I would perceive to be what Tetsuo seems to consider to be his main gripe with Kaneda? That's an interesting question. I don't know. I would always thought that Tetsuo's main gripe with Kaneda was the fact that Tetsuo, I mean, he didn't like to be pushed around, right? That was his main thing. He didn't like to be pushed around. He there's many points in his life where he couldn't help but not be pushed around, but that's what he didn't like. And who was doing the pushing around in his life? It's probably Kaneda for the most part. Now, that's the thing with this kind of dealing with authority. Sometimes, and I mean, I was like this when I was a kid growing up with my parents. A lot of the times is, I would always feel a little bit rebellious against my parents when they tried to discipline me. And it's only later when I realized that they had a reason behind their discipline. But it's the same sort of thing I feel for Tetsuo and his views of Kaneda and the way that Kaneda metes out his authority. I don't know if it's necessarily his feelings of critiquing how Kaneda doesn't necessarily appreciate the amount of power that he has per se, although I can see how that might be one reason why Tetsuo is resentful of Kaneda to begin with. And the reason why I question it is just I consider, I think the way that Tetsuo reacts at the moment that he realizes he has the power, and how he reacts against Kaneda, I think is so revealing. It's just so he's so contemptuous, so full of contempt against Kaneda, which doesn't suggest to me that he was critical of how Kaneda used his power before, but and that sort of thing. I think also there's an idea of manhood. The way that Kaneda exercises his power, it's in a way destroying the manhood of Tetsuo. And I think the ultimate expression of that was when Kaneda came to the rescue when Tetsuo and Kaori were attacked by the clowns. It was almost like Tetsuo was being emasculated. And he was so emasculated to the point where, remember in his rant, he said, when he was like saying, you can't order me around, why do you always have to save me all the time? I don't need your help, actually, I know that maybe you're right that one time, but I don't need your any help anymore. So he actually had to acknowledge that, he needed Kaneda's help, even in mid-rant. That is so suggestive of how emasculated he must have felt at that particular moment. And so, so it's this feeling of really getting back at Kaneda for making him feel so emasculated all the time. And I think that's yet another way in which this film expresses how a character here, Kaneda, and his exercise of power, namely his authority as the leader of this bike gang, really has a destructive quality to it, namely making Tetsuo feel emasculated. And so that's how I see it. But I love your reading of this, Glenn. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Chance Hutchinson, thank you for these dice. You are very welcome, Chance. And in fact, thank you for being a part of this. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Chance asks, anyone cover whether Criterion will or can release this via Blu-ray? Don't know. I wouldn't hold my breath because it doesn't seem like it will happen. That's just my own intuition or hunch. This is the Laserdisc. It's actually, it was Laserdisc. The film was so nice, they released it twice. Let's see here. They actually released this under two separate Laserdisc spine numbers. One, here it is. This is the CAV Special Edition, and it's over a number of discs, and it's beautiful. Look at that. This is one of the best Criterion Laserdiscs releases they ever made, and I understand that this is actually quite expensive on the used market. I hope not, because it's really good, but the reason why I say I hope it's not that expensive is because I do hope that many people are able to get their hands on this if they want it at a reasonable price. It's not, you know, I don't want to get into the Laserdisc market now, but here's the other one, which is also Criterion Laserdisc. This is CLV, and so there's that. It doesn't have a fold out or anything like that, but this is spine number 283. Really nice to have. But Criterion did that occasionally. They'd have a title that they'd release under two separate Laserdisc spine numbers. If anyone is interested, I can make a separate video about that one day, but they did that for AKIRA anyway, and they did that for a number of titles elsewhere. Halloween is another example. Dead Ringers, I think, is another example. Yeah, it would be great if this film came back into the Criterion Collection as a Blu-ray. If so, please present it in as many versions as possible, but please include the original Japanese 2.0 mix. Let's see here. Okay. Yeah, Pete 1972 says, changes in 5.1 mixes makes having the original mix in good quality even more crucial. The original mix is what was heard in theaters and tends to have more impact, to be honest. Yes, I agree with you for the most part. I mean, there's nothing wrong in theory with a 5.1 mix that's made after the fact, or that's prepared after the fact. There's nothing wrong with that in principle or in theory. But it's just when you actually hear it, it's what you end up really preferring that really makes the difference, does it not? And so if it makes a change, an actual substantive change to what was heard earlier, then it really has the effect or potential effect of altering the whole tenor of a particular scene, which can really have a lasting effect on the whole overall impact of a film itself. It's like a house of cards, really. And so that's why I'm very much lamenting why that change in music in that particular scene that I mentioned earlier was made. So, oh well, c'est la vie, I suppose, but okay. Alan says, Daisuke-san, another amazing film club life. Thank you very much, but Daisuke is fine. No son required, but I appreciate the gesture. It's very kind of you. All right, so let's see. Pete 1972 asks, can I ask a little random question? Have you ever been on live streams with other YouTubers? I could be wrong, but I remember titles of your videos saying that you were on other. I don't know if they're live streams, but I have joined other YouTube channels, such as Razor Wire Reviews. I don't know if they weren't live streams, but they were discussions between the two of us that were then recorded or edited and then uploaded later. So they weren't live, but I'm not against live streams with other YouTubers. In fact, I welcome the opportunity. I've tried to put that together with other YouTubers in the past, but it's never worked out, not for any reason other than I don't understand the technology. And so if anyone who is a YouTuber is interested in having a live stream, live discussion with me, please invite me, and I depending on if our schedules are agreeable with each other, I'd be very welcome to the opportunity for that. And the reason why I say that is because I don't know the technology, and so if someone else can help me with the technology, I'd be very happy to have a live conversation recorded on YouTube. And it doesn't have to be on my channel, it can be on your YouTube channel. I don't mind, because, as I say, I have no ability to command the technology that's necessary. So I'd need assistance or help on that. But if anyone is willing to do that and wants to have a live stream, live chat with me for YouTube video posterity or whatever, and it's nothing that's out of my sphere of comfort in terms of discussion topics or anything like that, then that would be very interesting. But anyway, let's see. I have to wind down. So let me just say, it's as a closing comment, a brief closing comment about this film, AKIRA, and then I'll join the live chat and I'll call it a day here. But the film, as an entity, as a kind of experience, is a one-of-a-kind experience that I hope I've made clear in my comments here, that I think is very, very timeless. It is a film that works so well even now. One watches it now and one is amazed how strong it holds up, how strongly it holds up. And it's a kind of visual spectacle. It's an oral experience. It's an assault on the senses. Even now, I remember the tagline for the U.S. release of the film back in the late 80s, early 90s, right? Neo Tokyo is about to explode. Well, I don't think there's been a more fitting tagline in English than that for this film, because really there's a lot going on here that will explode the senses, delight the mind, really captivate, aggravate, confuse, delight. But even those aggravations and confusions are cause for celebration, because it means, hopefully, it makes you want to go back and watch this film again and again and again and again, to try to solve its mysteries and to try to untangle its entanglements, and really try to grapple with this film. And I think that's a great indication of how vital this film is, how important this film is, how breathtaking, how entertaining, how memorable and unforgettable this film is, because it's a film that makes you want to go back and watch it more and more and more. And even with multiple viewings, it is so it refuses to yield its answers easily, which makes it a kind of a timeless and breathtaking work of art that at its core has such an emotionally resonant and beautiful and tragic story that gives it so much life that will continue for many, many years, in my opinion. It's continued for this long. It will continue for many, many years to come. I can guarantee that. This is the film AKIRA, Katsura Otomo's masterpiece, AKIRA, from 1988. Initial release 1988. Okay, so that's it for now. But let me just go to the live chat and call it a day. Okay, so Eddie Who says, checking in late. Nice to be able to catch you, Daisuke. Well, it's nice to see you live, so thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Carl's Rants and Reviews says, thanks for another awesome film club, Daisuke. Thanks for discussing this awesome anime. Do you think you might discuss Ghost in the Shell sometime? Oh gosh, that is a great idea. Let me think about that one. Glenn, thanks for this segment and sharing your passion with the world. Well, thank you. No, not at all. Not at all. I'm very grateful to you and your comments, especially your comments today about this film. You obviously have a great love for this film, Glenn, and it's my pleasure to be able to hear your thoughts about that. That take that you had that I talked about, that take you had about how Tetsuo perceives Kaneda's power. That's very, very, that's a kind of a very thought-provoking comment, and I've never thought about that in that way before. You've given me much to think about, Glenn, so thank you. Jared, thank you for the live stream, Daisuke. Have a good night and hope you'll have a great day tomorrow. Thank you very much, Jared, my friend, my dear friend, for your wonderful comments as well. You helped me to your comments were great in and of themselves, as always, but they also helped me to jump into some areas of discussion that I was planning to talk about anyway, but it were nice ways to connect into those. So thank you so much. And I'll talk to you soon, my friend. And let's see, Glenn says, by the way, can't wait for Otomo's upcoming film and collected works. Yes, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. So, and let's see, Mike says, did anyone, let's see. Oh, yeah. Mike says, did anyone else notice the gang member vomit blood as they were being released from jail? I just noticed this and it cracked me up. Yes, I think you're referring to Kai, the young gang member who wears the tie, and he's one of the people who survives at the end of the film. It's not, just to be clear, it's not when they're leaving the jail, but when they are leaving the school, the Ward 8 vocational school, and they're going into, I think it's the school principal's office or something, and they're all lined up in front of the old guy on the desk who's just so contemptuously just wiping the lenses of his glasses as the huge guy just like punches each of the kids one at a time. And that they're leaving that place and they meet the groupies, their girlfriends who are waiting outside. And as they're walking from the school, it's a school, right? That's when you see the clip of it's like one of the girls is putting a tooth back, I think, right? And then Kai, who actually there's no girl near him, right? All the other girls are with, there's Kaneda and Yamagata, but no, I don't think he's got a girlfriend, right? Kai, I'm not sure, but he's by himself, but he's there trying to attract attention by basically vomiting blood. It's quite a scene. It's actually quite a comic scene, but it's very grotesque at the same time. So yeah, it's a great one. So okay, so thank you. But Mike, thank you. Thank you very much for bringing up that detail. It's one of those little details make this film so memorable. I didn't even talk about it. I know I should end, but I didn't even talk about those little details in the film that I think are so striking as a piece of cinematic art. For example, the choice when the colonel is going down into the cryogenic chamber. And as he's going down on that huge lift, it cuts to a flashback of him in the elevator talking with the doctor. And, that use of flashback is very weird. And also there's another shot of a zoom into his face and he's walking with some army personnel and it just suddenly turns into his inner monologue in his head. Or, the way in which there are sudden jump cuts as Kei and Kaneda get on one of those little flying things when they're trying to infiltrate the sewer part of the lab, and they're trying to get into the central core, and they jump on one of those little flying things and they fly through the air, and you get a quick shot of Kyoko, the profile face of Kyoko. She turns and she realizes, oh, Kei is there, so that helps to convince her that she can establish a psychic connection with Kei. And those little cinematic bits that make the film quite, or like even little things like when at the very beginning when we first see Kaneda approach the bike that Tetsuo is sitting in, and he calls that Tetsuo. Tetsuo's riding on Kaneda's bike. And he's looking at all the buttons and the levers and all that, and then Kaneda walks out of the Harukiya and walks down the alley and calls out Tetsuo, and Tetsuo turns his head, and I mean, I say camera, it's not right, but it moves like that as Tetsuo turns his head and he moves like that. It's such a cinematic flourish. It's a really wonderful way to create movement. And I just love those little details that give this a feeling of cinematic vitality. That, I mean, it could have been just easy for the shot to have been just Tetsuo turning his head, but no, it was just turning his head and it moved like that. That gives it a great sense of dynamism. And this film is filled with that. And I love those touches that are that give. Oh, and also, like even little things like when the clown falls off his bike, when he hits the wall just before Tetsuo really hits him with the wrench or something, it's a slow motion shot of the guy rolling, his body rolling on the road there. So vivid, and it really helps to hallmark the way in which there's a lot of physical pain that many of the characters undergo in this film, and that sort of slow motion shot is, I think, a great example of course, it's not really slow motion because it's animation. I understand that, but it's depicted in a way that's suggestive of a slow motion shot that you'd see in a live action film. These are just more examples of how cinematically dynamic this film is, and those little treats, visual treats, and those stylistic flourishes that are throughout this film, I think make this a really great example of wonderful cinema. Okay, so let's see. All right, so M.E. or Me is here. Nice, great film. Thank you very much. Yes, I agree. And Mike Eli says, yes, that's right, my No, that's not a problem at all. As I say, there's a lot going on here, but yeah, actually, you are right in the sense that it does follow after the group leaves the jail or leaves their being in custody. Yeah, and let's see. So the next film, yes, is going to be 2 weeks from now. Let's see, 2 weeks from now, which is March 7th, Saturday. And so the same time, so 11 p.m., Saturday, March 7th, the film is going to be Afterlife, which is this film, Wonderful Life, or Afterlife. So if you can get your hands on this between now and 2 weeks from now, I strongly suggest that you can. I know this is now on like in North America, this is like an out-of-print DVD or something like that. So if your only means of being able to watch this film is through some kind of overly expensive used DVD on eBay, I wouldn't. It's not worth it. Don't feel like you have to spend, what is it, hundreds of dollars or something like that and try to watch this film. But if you can watch the film on a reasonable price, then I would strongly recommend it, because this is really great. I haven't thought about it with much specificity, I admit, but it could be my favorite Koreeda film. It could be. And so I look forward to discussing this very much with you in 2 weeks' time. So let's see. So I will just, yeah, it's now 2 o'clock, so I've been going for 3 hours. So it's time for me to go to sleep. So anyway, my friends, thank you very much for your time. I apologize if I've skipped over any comments or questions that you've had, but feel free to leave comments in the video comment section after this is uploaded to the channel. And until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great films. I hope that you have a great rest of your day, wherever you are. I am going to go to sleep now because, fortunately, my mind is not. It's a little bit feeling a little bit groggy, so I'm not speaking so clearly right now. That's due to my own tiredness. So. In a good way, though, too, because I feel like it was a great time well spent, but I just need to get to bed now because it is bedtime for me. But I still enjoyed myself very much, my friends. So thank you, and I will see you hopefully very soon. And until then, my friends, be well and cheers. right. Thank you very much. So that's another fun live stream. So thank you. Oh gosh, I wasn't planning on talking for this long, but this is a very complicated film. Very complicated film. One day, I would love to be able to talk about the manga, one volume at a time. There's 6 volumes. Gosh, that would be a dream come true if I could talk about the manga on this, kind of like I don't know, like a 40-minute video for each volume of the manga. That would be a dream come true. I don't know if I'll be able to do that, but maybe one day. Maybe one day. It's something to think about anyway. Okay, my friends. If you haven't read the manga, by the way, strongly recommend it. It's a completely different story. Well, not completely. It's kind of the same, but really, really different in many ways. So really interesting. If you haven't read it, strongly recommend it. But, okay, my friends. That's it for me. So thank you and take care. Bye. Oh, one more time. There you go. Bye.